Made for the South Pole. Book 7 in the Romance Island Resort series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 1. Nothing brought a smile to Jean's face like penguins. There was just something about them that could make anyone happy. Here on Heard Island there were hundreds of them, waddling around Wharf Point without a care in the world. Triumph exploded in Jean's chest. He'd found them. Now all he needed to do was find a high vantage point, where he could see if there were any babies in the colony. A moss-covered mound looked to be the highest point on this part of the Azorella Peninsula, so Jean scrambled across the dark volcanic rock toward his own personal grassy knoll. Once he reached the top he'd see the cushion plant beneath his feet compressed under his weight. Sinkhole. One word was all Jean had time to think before the fragile net gave way. Falling into darkness. 1 second. 2. 3. Was it eternity, or did it just feel that way? The impact jarred every bone in his body, forcing the breath from his lungs. He lifted his head to watch the cloud of condensation whoosh upwards, a smoke signal to mark his location, but there was no sky to be seen above. The traitorous bush had covered its trap, Jean realized. Damn Australian territory, even if it was part of Antarctica and not the Aussie mainland. Even the plants were trying to kill him. But he was a goddamn Canadian biologist, and not city-bred either. He'd grown up next door to the Arctic, and he wasn't about to be outsmarted by a plant on the wrong side of the world. Jean extended his arms, reaching for a wall or a rock or something else to haul himself up on. He couldn't have fallen that far. A couple of meters, maybe. No more than 3. His fingers touched cool smooth stone. Ha! He must have lost his glove on the way down. Just one though, he still wore the other one. He ran his bare hand over the rock, looking for a ledge or bulge big enough to wrap his hand around to take his weight. He found a hole big enough to fit his whole hand inside, then another, and that was enough. Under his breath he muttered, 1 2 thr. The moment he put weight on his leg, pain knifed through him. Much like space in a lava tube on Heard Island, no one could hear you scream. Breathing hard, Jean leaned on his other leg instead. This time he didn't get to scream. The pain was so bad, it stole all of his senses as it knocked him out. 2. Audra had never been so exhausted in her life, so naturally, she wanted to dance on the ceiling. She wasn't sure how many people had actually seen the South Pole, but now she was one of them. It felt exhilarating. Hence the need to dance as soon as she could shut the door of her tiny room, where no one would see. The buzzing in her blood was better than sex. Everyone had sex. Except her room wasn't hers. Well, it was, but it was someone else's too. The vacant bunk she'd considered her reading lounge was now occupied by a girl with a round, smiling face. Hi. Finally we meet. I'm Shelley. You must be Audra. The guys told me it's your first trip, and you've already seen the pole. 3 winters I've spent here, and my first expedition out there, I failed the medical, and you got to go instead. I'm sure there'll be others. Some of the equipment wasn't up to spec, so when the right stuff arrives next summer, a team will need to return. Audra couldn't keep the longing out of her tone. Of course she wanted to be part of it. Who wouldn't? But she was only covering Shelley's maternity leave, after all, and it looked like her time was up. How's your little girl anyway? Now it was Shelley's turn to look wistful. She said her first word the day before I left, Mum. It killed me to leave her, but Ross and I agreed that he'd get to be a stay-at-home dad with her while I went off to work. God, I hope he can handle it. She waved at their cramped room. This'll seem like a holiday in comparison though. They both laughed. Sorry, you probably want a minute to yourself after all that time in the field. Video calls home and such. I'll go take a shower before the boys use all the water. Shelley grabbed her towel and slung it over her shoulder. Watch out for the shower monitor. He's a big Russian bloke named Boris. If you try to take a shower even a second longer than 3 minutes, he'll bust in and carry you off for torture and whatever else Russians do to traitors. Apparently. Shelley's face fell. You mean Bruce left? He's the best plumber on the continent. Audra couldn't hide her smile. No, but he did spend a whole day booming at me in a thick Russian accent until one of the other guys ratted him out. I've never forgotten to time my showers since. Shelley laughed and headed for the showers. Alone, Audra decided dancing was probably a bad idea, so she dusted off her laptop and woke it up. Calling home could wait until tomorrow, but she could catch up on news and email in the meantime. Hundreds of unread emails awaited her, so she sighed and sat down to sort the spam from the 63 emails from Jay. More? Huh. She hadn't heard a peep from him since she left Romance Island, and she never expected to either. Well, okay, for the first week she'd kind of hoped, and maybe for the second one too, especially after she'd sent him the photo of them together, and the third week. But by the time she'd boarded the Aurora Australis, she'd barely checked her email at all. And not because of the restricted internet access, either. So why on earth was he sending her thrice daily emails? Curiosity won, and she opened the most recent one. Why won't you answer my messages? Another. We were made for each other. Where are you? That popped up a lot, though the wording varied a bit, depending on the day. After the first couple dozen, Audra skimmed to the first one he'd sent. I'm home. Where are you, baby? Why aren't you here? Had he completely forgotten about her new job? The reason she was leaving the island? Maybe he was drunk. It still didn't explain why he thought she should be at the resort. Exasperated, Audra typed a response. I'm at Davis as one of the Antarctic meteorology team this summer. I just got back from an expedition to Dome Argus and the South Pole. It was awesome, thanks for asking. She hit send and scrolled through her emails, looking for anything from her family and friends. Her laptop chimed, signaling that someone wanted to start a video call. Jay, who else? She hadn't had a shower in days, and her hair had been mashed under an assortment of hats and hoods for weeks. One look at her would scare him off for life. Reluctantly, she allowed the call to connect. Where the fuck are you really? Jay Felix was all charm. Audra took a deep breath. She'd thought the soundproofing at the resort was bad. Here at Davis, if she raised her voice, the whole building would hear. Hi Jay. It's lovely to see you again. It's been months, I'm sure, though I gather you've been busy with your band's tour. I've been very busy too. First training for my first Antarctic expedition, and then living and working out here for the summer. There are real penguins here, not just a jetty named after one. I must say, the jetty smells better though. Why aren't you here? Judging by his slurred voice, sobriety had deserted him several hours ago. I don't work at Romance Island Resort anymore, remember? No. Was it because of me? Did you quit because of me? I told you I was coming back, babe. I own the hotel. Had to come back. He hadn't known? Then what had he meant that night when they'd... That last night we spent together. When you answered the door, you said I was just in time and I'd left it until the last minute. You knew it was my last day and I was flying out to Hobart on Monday. No, I fucking didn't. You never told me that. Audra mulled this over. So let me get this straight. You spent the night with me, made all sorts of promises you had no intention of keeping, then flew out the next morning to record your new album and go on tour. All the while, not saying a single thing to me. Not a word, a phone call, an email, nothing, until now, when you're demanding to know why I'm not waiting for you with open arms after you deserted me. I didn't desert you. I had to work. And who doesn't? When I got offered the chance of a lifetime, a stint in Antarctica, I took it. I'd have been crazy not to. Especially after dealing with VIPs who threw tantrums, painted the walls with ketchup, and slept with anything in a skirt. She'd never get the image of Jay and Penny out of her mind. It would scar her for life. Ooh, is that your boyfriend? Hi, I'm Shelley, Audra's roommate. Shelley smiled and waved over Audra's shoulder before throwing herself on her bed. Don't mind me. Yes, I'm Audra's, Jay began. Audra cut in, no, he's not my boyfriend. Never was, never will be. He used to be my boss. Though it was on the tip of her tongue, she didn't add that he'd once been the bane of her existence. It didn't seem fair to kick a man when he was down. What about all the time we spent together? Jay exploded. Are you honestly saying everything, the time, the incredible sex, meant nothing to you? Audra heard Shelley laugh softly, then whisper an apology. It was one night, Jay. One night that you made astonishingly clear meant nothing to you, when you climbed into a helicopter the morning after, then ignored me for months while wrapping yourself in different girls every night. Do you even remember how many? I mean, you did 20-30 shows at least, and I know for a fact that you took half a dozen girls back to your hotel room after the Perth concert. Add that all up and I don't need to be a statistician to know you've probably slept with over 100 women, while you didn't even have time to send me an email saying hi. She drew in a deep, shaky breath. If it weren't for the other girls, maybe I'd be interested if we were to meet again. But right now, if you showed up in the snow outside my door, I'd kick you right back to the boat that brought your sorry ass to Antarctica. His eyes got that kicked puppy look that a dog gets when. Audra had never kicked a puppy, but she figured hurt and betrayal and big, wide eyes would feature in there somewhere. But I could fly there now. We can talk about this. I could take you home and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. How about it? A fresh start with just you and me. I'll marry you if that's what you want. No other women ever again. I swear. That same beseeching look she'd surrendered to before. Never again. Jay, you barely know me. Normal people don't marry strangers. Especially not strangers who've slept with 100 other people in less than 6 months. Please, baby, give me time to book a flight and... Audra's heart nearly broke at the pain in his voice, but somehow she mentally sticky taped it back together and said, no. I ship out in a couple of days. Even if you did fly here, I'd be gone, on my way back to Melbourne to finish my training. I told you before, if you want a girl to love you, you have to be more than a rock star. Go back to the hotel library and do some more research. You'll see what happens to guys who cheat. They don't get the girl, that's for sure. She sighed. I'm sure she's out there, Jay, the right girl for you. But I'm not her. So good night, and good luck. Before he could say anything, she ended the call and slammed her laptop closed. Shelley whispered, was that really Jay Felix? Audra nodded. And you used to work for him? Another nod. Shelley cleared her throat. He's always had a reputation for, well, you know. But I've always wondered if it was true or just something the girls made up. What's he like in bed? In alarm, she added, I'm only asking in the name of scientific inquiry, of course. Happily married and stored in this fridge and all. Audra smiled faintly. Unbelievable. Shelley inhaled sharply. I knew it. Wait, in a good way or a bad way? Both. They both laughed, but Audra's heart wasn't in it anymore. Shelley was sensitive enough to stop. He seems really into you despite all his obvious failings. Is there any chance you and him might, reconnect? In some way? Audra shook her head. If he grew up a bit, and maybe turned into a good man instead of a spoiled, selfish asshole, maybe. But I think hell will freeze over first. She glanced out the window and noticed snow flurrying past the glass, dancing in an evening breeze that she'd never grow tired of watching. Unseen by anyone, her tears for Jay dropped onto the windowsill. 1, 2, 3, 4. The beats of a song that only her heart knew. Audra. The deep voice belonged to Bruce. I need your help. Audra wiped her eyes. It was silly to cry over a rock star. Especially if someone needed her. You need to pack your things. The Aurora Australis is here early. There was an emergency at Heard Island, so they detoured to pick up a man who was injured. The doctor's on standby at Casey, but they want someone with medical training to travel with him. Seeing as you're shipping out anyway, you just got volunteered. No time for tears. Audra had a job to do. 3. Freezing water lapping at his legs dragged Jean out of the darkness. He was already waist-deep, and it was rising. Darkness didn't help him work out where he was, until he remembered the cushion plant trying to kill him. He reached under the surface, feeling far enough down his legs to determine that they were both broken. Bits bent in ways that they shouldn't be capable of being bent. Up was out then, if he couldn't use his legs to climb to the top of the sinkhole. That meant he'd have to follow the lava tube to wherever it went. Wherever the water had come in. Quickly too, because he already couldn't feel his legs. That's because of the water temperature, he told himself, willing his mind away from what else that could mean. More bones broken than just his legs. If his back was broken and he couldn't walk again, there were other bits of his anatomy that wouldn't work either. Darren. She'd never forgive him if he came back, and it was his fault they couldn't have kids. He'd promised to give her children. If he didn't make it home safely, she'd kill him. No. He'd never broken a promise to her yet, and this wouldn't be the first. Jean fought to keep his breathing steady. No panicking. He had to get home to Darren, which meant getting out of this hole. The camp wasn't far. He'd seen the penguins from the shore, damn it, on the far side of Atlas Cove. All he had to do was get to where the geologists could see him from camp. He was wearing a standard issue fire engine red jacket, for fuck's sake. They couldn't miss him. Now to get out of this hole. Jean closed his eyes, trying to trace the sound of the waves. He rolled over onto his belly, propping himself up with his arms so his head was above water. Like a seal. He snorted. He wished there was a seal in the cave with him, to show him the way out. Without a seal, he did the best he could, angling his body so the wavelets broke against his chest. Fuck, but it was freezing. The sooner he was out of the water, the better. Jean dragged himself along the cave floor, first one arm, then the other in endless repetition until the ground dropped away and a wave broke over his head. He surfaced, spluttering, wishing he'd thought to bring a radio with him. He could have called for help, and told the rest of the team he'd run into trouble a few minutes' walk from camp. Sure, he'd be a laughing stock for the rest of the expedition, but he'd be a warm laughing stock. Another wave topped him, and Jean went under. This time he didn't surface straight away, because he thought he saw light ahead. He squinted, trying to focus, to no avail. It was a light of some kind, all right, but the rock in front of him told him he'd have to swim underwater to reach it. He'd need a decent lungful of air for that. Jean lifted his head above the water, paddling with his hands to stay up. I'm coming, Darren, he swore, gulping a huge breath before he dived. He tried to kick with his legs, but the damn things wouldn't work. He breaststroked like a man possessed, pushing the water behind him as he paddled toward the light. Jean's lungs burned, but he swam on. He angled upward, praying he'd reach the surface soon. He could see his hands in front of him now, surely he'd cleared the cave. Was he out, or just in a larger cavern? Wind froze the water in his hair as Jean's head emerged from the sea. He sucked in a desperate breath, then another, as he took stock of his surroundings. Oh fuck. He'd surfaced in the cove, 20 meters from the far shore. He had more swimming to do. His arms were all he had, so no way in hell was he doing an Australian crawl. The near-freezing water was warmer than the air temperature. Gritting his teeth, Jean set a course directly across the cove toward camp. He tried not to think of leopard seals and orcas and anything else that lived in these waters. For the first time, he cursed being a biologist who knew this shit. At least there weren't any sharks, unless global warming had finally tempted them south. That would be the ultimate insult for a climate change biologist, to be eaten by something migrating with the warmer temperatures. Not today, Jean swore. I'm coming, Darren. I'm coming home. His arms ached, more and more leaden with every stroke, until his hand bumped against something harder than water. Please don't let it be an orca, he prayed, glancing down. A wave carried him further up the shore until his whole body rested on rock. Sharp chunks of volcanic rock, but right now it was the most beautiful beach he'd seen this week. He barely felt it through the numbing cold. Jean lifted his head. The camp was just ahead. All the buildings, where someone should be preparing dinner while everyone else relaxed after a hard day in the field. The buildings were there, sure, but no one was in sight. Maybe they were all inside, he reasoned. A team meeting or something. Someone would be out soon. They'd see him and carry him to one of the huts, so they could help him. He counted to 500 as he waited, but there was no movement at all. Had they decided to sleep aboard the research vessel instead then? Jean groaned as he stiffly rolled onto his back, propping himself up on his elbows to peer out into the cove for the ship. Which wasn't there. Fuck. While he'd been unconscious in his hole, the geologists had taken the ship out for a survey. It might be weeks before they returned. By that time the leopard seals would have eaten his remains. Not going to happen, he grunted, flipping onto his belly. He'd crawl back to camp if he had to, and radio those single-minded scientists to come back and get him. Fixing his gaze on the nearest hut, the decades-old, round red emergency shelter that they dubbed the Apple, Jean stretched his arm out to pull him a foot closer to the forbidden fruit. 2 broken legs were a fucking emergency. One arm pull, then the other pull, reach for another handhold, pull, don't stop, reach. I'm coming, Darren. I'm coming, he repeated. His wife's name was his mantra. He had to survive for her. His fingers scrabbled at the blood-colored hut. He nearly cried. All he had to do was reach the handle 3 feet above his head, and pull open the door. Eternities passed as Jean dragged his exhausted body to the side, his arm muscles screaming as he reached up and up until his fingers closed on the handle. When the door swung open, he felt a tear trickle from his eye before it froze on his cheek. Fucking Antarctica. If it weren't for the penguins, he wouldn't be here. Jean crawled inside the hut, then hooked his fingers through the vent at the bottom of the door to pull it shut behind him. Out of the wind, but not out of the woods. He struggled out of his coat and all the layers under it, until he peeled his soaked thermal shirt from his chest. He was bare for only a moment before he grabbed a musty blanket from the bunk and wrapped it around himself. He turned a second blanket into a cape across his shoulders, hoping to keep in what precious little remained of his body heat. His sodden pants would be another story, he knew. Once feeling returned to his legs, the agony that he'd felt before would return in full force, and he might pass out again. He had to radio for help first. Jean dragged the survival kit onto the floor and pried off the lid. He had to rummage through the box until he found the radio, before rummaging some more for some batteries. His hands shook as he shoved the batteries into the back of the radio. He knew shivering was better than his body not reacting to the cold at all, but it still made it hard to call for help. Finally, he managed to close the little plastic cover. Offering a silent prayer to anyone who was listening that the batteries weren't dead, Jean flicked the switch. Blessed static washed over him. The best sound in the world. Jean pressed the talk button. This is Jean Pennant on Heard Island. I have a medical emergency and require immediate assistance from anyone who can hear me. Repeat, need medevac from Heard Island. If you can hear me. He repeated the message and waited. He eased off his supposedly waterproof pants. Oh fuck. It looked like he had 5 knees. Definitely not natural. He wasn't sure if he wanted to peel off the thermals he wore underneath. He couldn't see any blood, which was a blessing, but there still could be internal bleeding. He had to. Oh fuck, that hurt. No response from the radio. He switched to another channel and tried again. This is Jean-Pierre Pennant on Heard Island, requesting immediate assistance. More static. Next channel. Hello, this is Jean-Pierre Pennant. Another channel. This is an SOS to anyone who can hear me. This is Jean-Pierre Pennant at Heard Island. The static crackled and beeped. You're late for your 12-hourly check-in, Pennant. Oh, thank fuck. Yeah, about that. I fell down a hole. I may have broken a few bones. You're in luck. We're still at Spit Bay. Dismantling the huts took longer than we expected. There's a couple of elephant seals who aren't helping. Could have done with your help charming them. Jean coughed out a laugh. It was a Weddell seal that fancied me, dude. A baby one. It was cute and it was curious and it liked the taste of my boots. The sort of thing you want to cuddle. Not an elephant seal. You're the biologist. Are you sure you're injured if you're laughing and trying to teach? Feeling was returning to Jean's legs now he was out of the cold and it fucking hurt. I've got 2 broken legs, man. It's bad. Jean heard swaying before it was replaced by static. He waited a few seconds before he ventured, You still there? The crackling ceased. Yeah. We'll be there as soon as we can. Where are you? The emergency apple. The one we're not supposed to use. More static before the voice came back. Pennant? One of the guys here said there should be a first aid kit in there. The supplies might be a bit out of date, but it should be fully stocked. He said he saw some of the really good meds in there. Stuff we're not allowed to carry now, but were fine back when the camp was constructed. Should be unopened. Can you check? He says it's under one of the bunks. Jean felt around in the cavity under the nearest bed, and was rewarded by the feel of a metal box. Yeah, got it. He flipped it open and took stock of the supplies. Enough gauze to wrap a mummy with enough alcohol wipes to embalm one. And under that. Jean gave a low whistle. Shit. Morphine. Captain thinks we'll be underway in a couple of hours. Can you wait that long, Pennant? Jean peeled open a syringe and plunged the needle into the morphine bottle, carefully drawing out a dose that matched the instructions. He swabbed his arm and took a deep breath. Just a scratch, he told himself. Fuck, he hated needles. But this one would be worth it. He gritted his teeth as he depressed the plunger, unleashing icy oblivion into his veins. Pennant? Yeah, man. I found the meds. Good shit, man. Good shit. Jean gritted his teeth and shucked off the rest of his clothes. Oh, his legs were seriously fucked up. He tucked a couple more blankets around himself, hiding his legs from sight. But they didn't hurt anymore, and that's what mattered. No. What mattered was Darien. Getting home to Darien. Jean lay down, drifting off on a morphine cloud. No wonder they locked this shit up. 4. Hi, I'm Doug. Are you the nurse? A harried-looking crewman asked. Audra hesitated. No. I'm a meteorologist, but I've trained as a surgical assistant in case there's a medical emergency. That's better than the rest of us. We've got first aid and that's it. I'll take you to your patient. Doug reached for her bag and Audra let him take it. This way. She followed him to a part of the ship she hadn't seen before, but then, she'd only been aboard it for 2 weeks on her voyage south. Not long enough to injure herself so badly she'd needed medical assistance anyway. Admittedly, she'd worked at Romance Island Resort for months before one of the other maids had attacked her. Audra rubbed the back of her head in memory of where Penny had hit her hard enough to knock her out. It was nice to have a job where violence or guys who pressured girls into sex weren't part of a normal day's work. Antarctica was so civilized. Or maybe it was because she was officially a meteorologist here, not a maid. We talked to the doc at Casey Station as soon as we picked this guy up. She said to give him some intravenous medication as soon as he wakes up. I wrote down the dosage for you and everything. Doug ushered her into sickbay and grabbed the patient chart at the end of the curtained-off bed. Here. Audra scanned the sheet. He's on morphine? What's wrong with him? Some pretty nasty fractures. Want to see? Doug reached for the blanket. Audra shook her head. No. I'm good, thanks. I just need to put an IV in, right? That's what the doc said. There's a phone there and we have a video conferencing hookup here if you want to call her to check. Doug hefted her bag onto his shoulder. Do you need anything out of this, or do you want me to take it to your bunk room? That'd be great, thanks, Audra said, still puzzled by the patient's notes. When did you give him his last dose of medication? Doug paused in the doorway. Oh, we didn't. He did. He did? Audra turned her gaze on the patient. What is he, Shash? Who breaks bones and then administers their own first aid? Doug shrugged. No, not Shash. He's American. They have special forces or something like that. He dosed himself but he smashed the bottle, so we don't know how much he took. That's why the doc said to wait until he wakes up, so you can ask him. Good luck. He left. Wonderful. Her first real patient was a war hero, and she got to stab him with a needle. No wonder they wanted him awake first. God only knew what the American military trained their soldiers to do to someone stupid enough to stab them in their sleep. Nothing good, that's for sure. She sighed, picked up the phone and called Casey. 10 minutes later, she ended the call, none the wiser. Yes, the man had radioed for help. When the ship arrived, he was unconscious in his hut, lying beside a patch of damp carpet and a smashed morphine bottle. No one knew how much he'd taken or when or whether he'd taken more than one dose. So she had to sit and wait. Audra wished she'd brought a book. Sighing, she settled in a chair beside the mystery man's bed. Unlike most of the men at Davis Station, he hadn't grown a beard. The dark stubble across his face said he'd been clean-shaven before his accident. His hair was shaved short too, like a military regulation haircut. Audra pulled back the sheet that covered his torso, baring his chest and his upper arms. Very well-muscled arms, like he might have quit the military, but he still trained daily. Now she understood why no one could say how many doses he'd taken. The man's statuesque body was covered in bruises, hiding the injection site. That'll teach you to wrestle with elephant seals, Audra remarked, trying to work out which arm was less bruised and easier to find a vein in. She patted his hand gently. You won't do it again though, I bet. He didn't even twitch under her touch. Maybe he was too deeply under with the morphine he'd taken. In that case, perhaps she should try to slide a cannula into a vein while he was unconscious and wouldn't feel it. Especially as this was her first. Audra took a deep, shaky breath. She had to do this. But first, she'd just check the IV stand to make sure everything was hooked up properly, ready to go, with the correct dosage programmed in. Yes, of course it was. She just had to stick a needle through his skin, tape it in place, and connect the IV line. Simple. She marched over to the sink and washed her hands with particular care. He wasn't going to get an infection from her. "Please don't try to kill me for this," she said in a tone she hoped sounded calm, "but I'm going to place a cannula in your arm so we can give you medication to help with the pain. It might hurt a bit at first, and if it does, you just tell me, okay?" No answer. Did a snore count? Audra didn't think so. She slipped a tourniquet around his arm, tightening it until it cut off circulation and made his veins stand out. She continued to tell him what she was doing, though she knew he couldn't possibly hear her. If anything, it kept her from throwing the needle down and saying she couldn't do this. She trained to look at weather and wind and storms, not bodies. Yes, she had trained for this, Audra reminded herself. An emergency surgical assistant, that's what she was, qualified to stab people in an emergency. And it was. "You might feel a sharp scratch," she murmured, biting her lip as she angled the needle. Just like she'd practiced. Just like she'd practiced. Just like. The needle pierced the skin and the clear reservoir at the top of the cannula filled with blood. Was that supposed to happen? She racked her brain and couldn't remember. That tiny bit of blood didn't matter, she decided, swallowing. She finished inserting the cannula, removed the needle bit, and taped it all off. "There. When you wake up, I'll be able to give you your medicine right away," Audra said, lifting her head to smile at the unconscious man. Blue eyes regarded her. Not unconscious anymore. Had he been watching her all this time? "I, didn't realize you were awake. I hope I didn't hurt you," she said. "Look, you were my first, but it's better than waiting until we reach a proper doctor at Casey. At least now you'll be all right for pain relief and stuff. If it knocks you out like the last dose did, you'll be home before you know it." "Home," he said indistinctly, like he was drunk. Or drugged, which of course he was. "Darling, I'm home." At least, that's what she thought he'd said. Audra didn't have time to think before he grabbed her, wrapping both arms around her so she couldn't escape. He sure was strong for a man lying in a hospital bed. He pulled her closer, forcing her head down. Her lips met his, and while she pressed hers firmly together, his tongue darted out of his open mouth to pry a way in. "Darling, it's baby-making time," he said, more clearly, dragging her forward so she nearly fell on top of him on the bed. It took her a moment to realize that was what he intended. Audra reached behind her, groping for the IV stand. If she could attach the IV line to his arm, maybe it would knock him out again. Soon. It had to be soon, because he was holding her so tightly it was getting hard to breathe. "No. Let me go," she insisted. "Baby-making time, darling," he insisted, moving in for another kiss. There. Her hand found the table where she'd left the medical supplies, and her fingers closed around something cold and hard. Audra jabbed the needle into his arm and the madman released his grip just enough for her to squirm free. "Darling," he protested. "I'm not your darling," Audra snapped, brandishing the needle. The man struggled to get up, but when he did, his legs bent, wrong. Broken, Audra realized. Both of them. No wonder he'd taken so much morphine. He made a sound that strangled in his throat before he passed out, presumably from the pain. "Now do you want pain relief or don't you?" Audra asked. No response. He could be pretending though. "You try that again and I'm going to let you go without any drugs until we get to Casey," she told him, reaching for the IV line. She edged closer to him, ready to drop the line and run if she had to, but he didn't move. She forced herself to take her eyes off his face to connect the line to the cannula, then felt her breath hiss out as it was done without him waking. Maybe he truly was unconscious. Still, she wasn't taking any chances. Audra scooted back out of his reach to turn on the pump. The man might be worse than J. Felix when it came to demanding sex, but he hadn't grabbed her again, so she owed him his medicine. "Is he awake?" Doug appeared in the doorway. "Not anymore," Audra replied. She considered telling Doug about what the man had done, but decided it didn't matter. Besides, what if Doug didn't believe her? She hardly believed it herself. Talking about it wouldn't help her forget, like she wanted to. He roused for a bit, but he's out again. The doc at Casey said to keep him medicated until we reach the station. Probably a good idea. Then he couldn't grab anyone else. She peeled off her gloves and threw them in the bin. "Aren't you going to do that?" Doug blurted out. "And risk rape?" "Not bloody likely. Anyone with first aid training can do it. Just hook up the next bag when the pump beeps." "Easy." Audra started scrubbing her hands in the sink. She wanted to wash her whole body. "Thanks then. I'm sure Sean here would thank you too if he could," Doug said. "Or his next of kin will when we get hold of her. We haven't been able to reach his wife." Audra felt Billa rise up in her throat. Lovely. Not only had Sean tried force her into bed with him, but he wanted to cheat on his wife. The asshole deserved both broken legs. "Where's my room?" Audra asked, not wanting to discuss the patient anymore. "Oh, I stuck you in bunkroom 3. Figured you're here first, so you get the porthole. The staff at Casey can fight over the rest." Doug grinned. Audra shut off the tap and wiped her hands dry. Shit, they were shaking. "Thanks. Hey, do you have anything to drink on this ship? I could really do with one." "Sure do. What's your poison?" Audra wet her lips. "What have you got?" She followed Doug out to the dining hall. In 2 days, she could hand Sean over to the doctor at Casey, happy in the hope of never seeing him again. 5. When Jean awoke, the first thing he became aware of was the whistling wind outside. He prayed that the ship would make it through the storm to retrieve him before the morphine ran out. There hadn't been much in the bottle, and he'd surely need another dose soon. Death wasn't an option. He had to get home to Darien. Jean pried his eyes open. Instead of the foam-insulated dome ceiling of the hut, he saw the cable-covered curve inside a cargo plane. Home. He was going home. The next time he opened his eyes, the ceiling was flat, white and much closer. Disinfectant seared his nostrils and something behind him beeped. Hospital, his fuzzy mind told him. As the days passed, the fog faded a bit, but never enough. Doctors talked of compound fractures and possible infection and all the metal things they'd inserted into his body to help the bones heal straight. Maybe they'd mistaken him for Wolverine. Surely these New Zealanders could tell the difference between a Canadian and the Australian actor who played the character in the movies. Not that he'd mind being Wolverine right now, so he could heal instantly and hop on a plane home. Instead, days turned into weeks as they pumped antibiotics into his body and wheeled him in and out of the operating theater. If he hadn't dragged his damaged legs into the water and along the beach, he wouldn't have to endure all this treatment, the doctors told him. Jean agreed with them. If he hadn't done those things, he'd be a frozen corpse in a lava tube. Then they told him there was a chance he wouldn't walk again. Screw that for a joke. When a woman walked into his hospital room and introduced herself as his physiotherapist, he nearly kissed her. Darien wouldn't like that though, so he controlled himself. Not that he'd have kissed the woman like he kissed his wife, of course. If Jean was one thing, it was faithful. He'd never love another woman the way he loved his wife. He'd do anything for her. including doing everything in his power to walk again, so he could pass the medical assessments to go back to Antarctica to finish his research. Once he had his PhD, he could settle down in Vancouver with her like she wanted, take a teaching position somewhere and be the best father he knew how to be. Jean threw himself into his physical therapy, like he was training for the Olympics. When they finally released him from hospital, he headed for the Antarctic Research Center near the airport in Christchurch, where the U.S. expeditioners had their staging area. His status as a PhD candidate at an American university earned him a desk and some temporary accommodation, where he spent hours working on his thesis in between daily sessions of physiotherapy. He would walk again. Without a wheelchair, without crutches, without leaning on anyone. When he returned home to Darien, he'd be a whole man again, not half of one, he swore. Daily he fought the urge to call her, but he'd promised he wouldn't, because she'd said the waiting between calls while he was in Seattle had killed her a little each time, and it would be worse this time, with him on the other side of the world. He understood. He missed her just as much, of course, but while he was out in the field, discovering new things every day, she kept to her routine. She'd work and spend the evenings at home or with her family in Vancouver, while catching up with her friends on the weekends. He'd slot back into that life as soon as he could, he swore. Shit, what he'd give for a family dinner, with her family or his. He took a break from thesis writing for another painful trip to hospital, to remove all the pins and rods that had held his smashed bones straight enough to heal, followed by more physical therapy, until the day when Jean was allowed to walk without crutches. He was glad Darien couldn't see him now, taking his first steps like the baby he hadn't given her yet, but he could count the days now. Soon they'd let him go home to her. Finally, the doctors declared him fit to fly. He had to swear to do daily exercises and attend a clinic in Vancouver, but he felt whole again. Whole enough to be Darien's husband. Winter gripped Christchurch when he flew out of the city, headed for summer at home for the first time in 2 years. He couldn't wait to see Darien again, 6 months earlier than expected. Maybe he'd give her that baby she wanted before the week was over. He'd damn well try. 6. Audra clutched at the lectern with both hands. So all I have left to say is, let's go out there, fellow graduates, and take the country by storm. Polite laughter rose over the applause as Audra headed for her seat, and finally allowed herself to relax. All through the Diploma of Meteorology course, she'd strive to get the best possible results. What she hadn't realized was that the student with top marks automatically became the valedictorian of the class, complete with speech responsibilities at graduation. Well, she discharged those responsibilities now, so all she had to do was collect her degree before she could head home to celebrate. She waited for her name to be called. A quick walk across the stage with a handshake from the director in the middle, before she was handed her piece of paper and allowed to return to her seat in the audience. At the end, the director stood up to give his speech, which was surprisingly short. When he was done, he waited for the applause to die down before he said, "I also have an announcement to make. As part of the Bureau's commitment to ongoing education, next year we're holding a contest. The prize will be a training voucher that you can use for courses, conferences or research, as long as it's relevant to your job. And you'll be paid for your training time too, for the duration of your course." Murmuring broke out among the audience. The director waved his hands for silence. "In order to win, we're looking for staff who can raise the Bureau's online profile, so we can continue to attract the best graduates for our diploma program. We're looking for blogs or social media accounts where our staff tell the world about a day in the life of a meteorologist, or photos of weather phenomena, or whatever it is about your job that you feel best represents the Bureau's mission and values. We feel that." Audra tuned out at that point. Most of her fellow students had already stopped listening, holding whispered conversations with those around them, or trying to catch the eyes of their family members in the other rows. She didn't have any family members here, they hadn't been able to afford the flights, let alone the hotel accommodation. She couldn't deny that she was disappointed, but she'd never really expected them to come. Now, when the ceremony ended, it meant she could take advantage of her lonely state and corner the director for a few questions about the contest. But first, she could have one drink before driving home, so she snagged a glass of sparkling wine from a passing waiter. It was definitely a champagne occasion. "I liked your speech, Audra." Audra nearly choked on her drink as the director appeared beside her. He held beer. "Thank you," she managed to say. "I hope you're considering entering the contest. With a record like yours, you could use it to fund a master's degree or even your PhD," he continued. That answered one of her questions. But how would it pay for a PhD? I mean, there aren't any course fees. Is the money enough for a scholarship for the 3 or 4 years it'll take? The director shrugged. "It's not enough to live off for 3 years, no. But you'd still have a full-time job with the Bureau for that time, so you shouldn't need to. What it will pay for is equipment and expenses, conferences and travel. And you'd have the full support of the Bureau to complete your degree, so you'd have a study leave allocation." "So basically the Bureau would pay me to get my PhD?" Audra asked. It sounded too good to be true. But first you'd have to win the contest. That's not going to be easy. We'll officially open it next week, and it'll run for 6 months until the end of March. You'll have 6 months to create content that can, go viral, I think it's called. Our PR manager is one of the judges, and she assures me there are several criteria you'll be assessed against. The quality of your message, the number of followers you have, how well you align with the Bureau's mission. Like I said, it won't be easy. Nothing was easy, especially not for Audra. Why should this be any different? She waved away his concerns. When you say social media, could it be an online video channel? Another shrug. I imagine so. Then I think I'll be entering, Audra said, sipping her bubbly. The director beamed. Good to hear. I look forward to your videos of, where are they posting you? Officially, we don't find out until Monday, Audra said carefully. But the chief meteorologist at Davis Station in Antarctica told me she'd requested a graduate this year, if a member of our class with the right training applied for a regional posting. I have it on good authority that I'll be on the next icebreaker south to Davis. Perfect for photos or video. After all, everyone loved penguins. But won't it be cold in Antarctica? You're from Perth, right? It doesn't snow there. At least the director of meteorology knew a bit about weather. Audra replied, yes. The coldest place on Earth, actually. And I helped install new equipment at Dome Argus last year, which isn't far from Vostok Station, where the coldest temperature ever was recorded. I'm dying to go back to the South Pole, director. And this posting would be a full year, including winter. I'm told the winter storms are nothing short of spectacular. The director looked stunned. I didn't think we sent graduates to Antarctica, let alone ones we hadn't fully trained yet. I'll be following your blog with interest. Video channel, not blog. No one read web pages when they could watch a video. She didn't correct him though. Thank you, director. The director moved off to speak to some of the other executive staff who'd turned out for the graduation, or, more accurately, for the free food and drink, and Audra drained her drink, setting the empty glass on a table. She made her way out of the building to her car, sober enough to easily manage the drive home. Not that it would be home for long. 8 months she'd lived in Melbourne, sharing a house with some other students, but that would change soon enough. Who'd have thought she'd one day call Antarctica home? 7. Jean climbed stiffly out of the taxi. Long flights had taken their toll on his body. He took care not to favor either leg as he shouldered his backpack and wheeled his duffel up the driveway to his house. The lawn looked like it was overdue for a mow. He'd take care of that tomorrow, once Darren let him out of bed. He dug his keys out and unlocked the door, grateful that the landlord hadn't changed the locks while he was away. He'd done that once while Jean was meeting with his research supervisor in Seattle, and he'd had to sit on the porch all day, waiting for Darren's shift to finish so she could come home and let him in. The smell of cooking hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd forgotten how good Darren was in the kitchen. That smell meant she was home. A grin lit his face as he headed for the kitchen. "You're home early," Darren said over her shoulder as she stirred something on the stove. "I thought I'd surprise you," he replied, closing the distance between them so he could kiss her. Darren spun on the spot, looking horrified. Jean? What are you doing here?" Jean stopped short, trying to tell if she was joking or not. "I'm your husband. I live here." "No, you bloody don't. We're divorced," she hissed. "Divorced?" Jean couldn't seem to make his tongue say the word, and his mouth wouldn't close either. "Since when?" he said hoarsely. "Since more than a year ago. I told you if you go to the South Pole, I didn't want to see or hear from you again. You left, so I filed for divorce. I told them to send your copy to the university, seeing as I didn't know where you were. But I thought you wanted children. You and me, we were going to start a family. Every day I was in Antarctica, I was counting down the days until I could come home to you." Jean stared at her in anguish. "I promised to give you a baby." His gaze dropped to her belly, always so flat in his memory. It was anything but flat now. She looked like she'd swallowed a weather balloon. "Is that you? Whose is? When's it due?" He couldn't seem to form a coherent sentence while his heart crunched into fragments inside his chest. "Ed and I are having twins and they're due next month if my obstetrician doesn't insist on delivering them early," Darren said reluctantly. "Edward." That pasty-faced IT guy in her office who looked like he'd never spent 5 minutes outside in the sun in his life. Jean had seen Ed eyeing Darren off at work parties, but Darren had never taken any notice of him. "Did he get you drunk at the work party, and that's when you slept with him? Is he going to be around to help you when they're born, or are you going to be a single mother with twins?" Jean bit out. Darren's hand delivered a stinging slap to his cheek. "Don't you talk about my husband like that. We celebrated our first anniversary a few weeks ago, Ed and me. He's everything a husband should be. He comes home at night. Takes care of me. And he's giving me a family, something you never managed to do." Guilty as charged, but there were extenuating circumstances. "I was away so we could build a future together, once I got back. I'm here now, Darren. Please don't do this." "I already have," she said tartly. "Get out, Jean. You shouldn't be here. If you're looking for your stuff, I sent it back east to your folks' place. There's nothing for you here." Her expression told him what her words couldn't. There truly was nothing for him here. Without another word, Jean turned on his heel and strode out of the house. It wasn't home anymore. 8. Audra had almost decided on her graduation gift. She'd been 90% certain before the director's announcement that she wanted an action camera for her second trip to Antarctica, as the lovely DSLR camera that Jay Felix had given her didn't always work well in polar conditions. Well, it worked for a little while until the cold got to the batteries and fogged up the lenses. But these cameras were designed to work when it was cold and wet. Even better, they were easy to operate while wearing thick gloves. The only question now was, which model to buy? She could afford the top-of-the-range one, and it would take awesome video to share on her yet-to-be-created channel, but... Her laptop chimed, alerting her to an incoming video call. Audra didn't even have to look at the name to answer. "Evening, Jay." "Congratulations," he replied. "I did get the date right, didn't I? It's your graduation?" He wore a shirt tonight. It must be cold at the resort where he lived. "It is," she said. "I'm now officially a qualified meteorologist." "Why aren't you out celebrating then?" "Who says I'm not?" Jay grinned. "Your webcam for a start. I recognize your room." A room he'd never been in, but it didn't matter. She'd started taking his video calls after a few weeks in Melbourne, and somehow they'd fallen into a strange friendship. "Still celebrating though?" Jay leaned forward so all Audra could see was his forehead. "I don't see any alcohol." "I drank it already," she admitted. "But I'm picking out a graduation gift. I've decided I need a video camera for my first graduate posting." "What's wrong with the camera I gave you?" She knew he'd whine. That was Jay, everything was about him. "It's a beautiful camera for a tropical island resort, but it's not so good in the snow." His eyes widened. "You're going back to Antarctica?" Audra beamed. "Yep. I can't wait." "When do you leave?" "Not sure yet. The first supply run leaves Hobart in October, so I have a few weeks at least." "Come up and visit me then," he said. Tropical Romance Island Resort would be a dream compared to wintry Melbourne weather. So tempting, especially as she'd be in Antarctica for close to 18 months, depending on the shipping schedules. "What about your latest girlfriend? That billionaire? Won't she object?" Jay had shared every detail of his failed relationships with her since she'd left. Sometimes she'd had to fight to maintain a straight face, and leave the laughter until later. The Black Widow mail-order bride was the funniest, but only Jay Felix could have done what he did with that virginity auction girl. As for the billionaire, she'd dismissed it as something the tabloids had made up, until Jay admitted he'd met the woman. "Haven't you watched TV lately? I'm sure the first episode of Rockstar Wants a Wife aired this week." "You didn't." Even as the words left her lips, Audra knew he most certainly had. A rock star who'd learned about love from reading romance books, though not enough romance books if he was turning to reality TV to find a wife, would be a prime candidate for one of those shows that matched eligible bachelors with suitable girls and filmed every awkward moment. Quickly, she pulled up a search window and found the show. She flicked through the news reports until she found one about the contestants. A dozen girls from all over the country, all dolled up for the camera as they announced their desires for true love and other fairy tales. One face looked familiar, so she took a second, longer look. Yep, that was Penny all right. The lazy maid who'd spent more time banging the men at the resort than doing her job. When Penny had been fired, she'd taken it out on Audra, almost braining her with some gym equipment. That psycho made the mail-order bride look damn near harmless. "Who won the show? Did you propose to her?" Audra asked. Jay laughed. "I can't tell you who won. But I can tell you I proposed." "Was it Penelope?" Audra demanded. "What? I can't. How did you? I can't." "Yes, in other words. He probably couldn't talk because she was there." "I'll come up to the resort for a few days. I'll tell you the dates when I've booked my flights," Audra said. "Don't bother booking the hotel or the helicopter. You'll be staying as my guest." She nearly refused, but she knew Jay wasn't offering it to make her feel obligated to him for the gift. It was just what he did for people. Besides, if she didn't like being there, she could leave. Sho, the helicopter pilot, knew her from when she'd worked there, and she could afford a hotel in town. Perhaps she should book one of those, just in case. "All right," Audra conceded. "I'll bring my new video camera, so I can test it out." It'll be great to see you again. That lost look in his eyes, damn. It was everything Audra had to steel herself against. She would not fall for it again. I've got to go. Things to sort out before tomorrow, and it's late. Good night, she said, ending the call midway through his goodbye. It wasn't a lie. She had to watch that reality TV episode, and find out just how deeply Penny had gotten her claws into Jay. Audra might not want the rock star for herself, but friends looked out for each other, and Penny was bad news in anyone's book. 9. Jean wasn't sure how he made it to Seattle. The haze of pain that clouded his every step barely let him think, let alone notice his surroundings. Who knew a broken heart could hurt so much? He tried calling Darien, but the number had been disconnected. He'd considered calling her family to get her new number, but he knew they were very protective of their only daughter. Not only would he be wasting his time, but he'd probably get a lecture from her parents or one of her brothers about how unhappy he'd made her. The one thing that saved him was a call from his research supervisor. Louis had received the thesis draft he'd sent from Christchurch, and he wanted to meet to discuss it. Jean grasped at the only thing he had left, his half-completed PhD that Darien had hated and finally divorced him for. So as he walked through the university campus in Seattle, heedless of the rain, he ran through his original project plan in his head. He'd been surveying the king penguin populations at all the Antarctic and sub-Antarctic islands, chasing the one species that was reputed to be thriving because of climate change. The numbers were clear, the king penguin population was on the rise. That finding alone was enough to earn him his PhD, and possibly some papers in the right journals. His research had two significant gaps though, Heard Island and evidence of new penguin colonies. His trip to Heard Island had been cut short because of his accident, so he didn't have the final count for the colonies there. But he knew what he'd seen out there, a big colony of penguins in a site where they'd never been recorded before. If he'd been able to determine if the colony was breeding, then his career was assured. He could write papers about the development of the new colony, and maybe instead of a teaching position in Vancouver, he'd be offered a research position someplace more exotic. It didn't even need to be exotic, as long as it was the other end of the world from Darien and Vancouver. Jean trudged up the stairs to Louis' office, then forced himself to wait patiently outside while some undergrad student asked questions about the most basic principles of penguin biology. Jean smothered a yawn as he leaned against the doorjamb, counting the minutes until the student finally said, "Thank you, Professor," and hurried off to his next class. He'd forgotten Louis was a professor. The man had more letters after his name than in it, but he still liked everyone to call him Louis. The man of the moment, Louis greeted him, clasping Jean's forearm as he leaned forward to pat him on the back. "How's it feel to complete your PhD in less than 3 years? And with your accident too, you're a goddamn trooper, man." Jean's jaw dropped. "Finished? But I only just sent you my draft." Louis grinned. "More than enough to get your degree, plus a couple of papers. Your sponsors will be thrilled. Maybe even enough to fund your postdoctorate research too, Jean had never planned on doing a postdoc, but now, "I need to get back to Heard Island," he blurted out. "One more season in Antarctica, to make my numbers complete. That new colony we decided was theoretically possible? Well, I know where it is. I was on my way there when I got injured. I have to get back, Louis. Those are my penguins. My discovery. I can't let someone else find them first." Louis' brow furrowed. "Another season out there? I know you were supposed to spend another year out there, but your results speak for themselves. You don't need to, you know. What will your wife say to you staying away longer?" His ex-wife wouldn't care. Jean swallowed, not wanting to talk about her. "I do need to. I really do. I mean, we've got the funding for it still, right? My sponsors still want positive stories about their activities in Antarctica, don't they? Or has that changed? Louis chuckled. Until they get permission to drill in Antarctic waters for oil and gas, of course they do. And a new colony, that'll mean plenty of pictures they can put out in the media too. Everyone loves penguins, especially the babies. So I'll ship out to McMurdo in October, for my final year out there? Jean suggested. Maybe I can check some of the other islands on the way, and see the difference from year to year. We'd have to find another expedition headed out to Heard Island, Louis said thoughtfully. Maybe even partially fund it, seeing as that's Australian territory out there, but they don't keep a permanent base on the island. Maybe if it's geology again or deep ocean surveys, I might be able to get your sponsors interested. He clapped his hands. Leave it with me. I'm sure I can work something out. In the meantime, let's discuss this thesis of yours. Between now and when you leave, you should have enough time to lick it into shape, ready to submit, if you don't find anything new out there. Maybe even draft a paper or two. Jean sank into a chair, grateful to be off his aching legs for a moment, and listened to Louis dissect the document as thoroughly as one of his biological specimens. The professor was a biologist to the bone. 10. Cho greeted Audra with a smile and a wave when she stepped out of Broome Airport Terminal. The tropical heat embraced her like an old friend, making her regret her decision not to take a posting in the tropics instead of the frozen wasteland that was Davis Station. Next time she promised the tropical weather. If the cold got too much for her, she could always request a transfer to somewhere warm for her next posting. Maybe even do her PhD on cyclones, so she'd have to work in the tropics. Ever the tour guide, Cho pointed out all the features of the landscape below as they flew north to the Buccaneer Archipelago and Romance Island Resort. Not much had changed, unless you counted the new campground and holiday villas at the Pearl Farm. What's it been like with the resort's new owner? Audra asked as Cho paused for breath. Interesting, he bit out, clamping his mouth shut. Then he glanced at her and decided to elaborate. If I tell you, will you keep it confidential? Audra nodded. I worked here long enough to know what happens at the resort stays at the resort. Penny walked free without even an assault charge when she tried to kill me. If I manage to keep that quiet, nothing you tell me can be worse than that. Rape, but it got covered up. Cho looked angry. He crashed my helicopter too. J. Felix did that? I don't believe it. Cho nodded. Believe it. It was on the Easter weekend. The weekend Jay spent with Flavia, Audra remembered. He'd sent her a hamper of Hayes Easter eggs, and when she'd called to thank him, he'd spilled the whole story about the girls' virginity auction and the weekend they'd enjoyed together. I thought he was busy with Flavia then. It must have been someone else. Cho's expression turned grimmer still. It was him all right. The hotel manager caught them together. Him and the girl who sold her virginity. Audra shook her head firmly. That's not what he told me. Jay wouldn't do that. She'd experienced firsthand how persuasive Jay could be, but at no point had she been scared of him. He was the first man she'd ever met who actually listened to the word no, even when he didn't like it, and every bit of her body except her mouth screamed yes. Her memory itched and her gaze darted to the seat beneath her. I know it's not true because their first time was here in your helicopter. Jay said he made a mess and something about you trying to kidnap him. She didn't mention Jay's weakness for blood and the trouble that had caused. That was Jay's secret and not hers to tell. He left used condoms on my seat, Cho growled. Audra laughed. It could have been worse. Believe me. Cho glanced at her. You used to clean his villa when you worked here, didn't you? What could be worse than cleaning that up? Ketchup on the ceiling. Chocolate on the walls and the rug. Frogs and broken glass in the bathtub. Patching up Jay's fragile ego when something bad happened, as it inevitably did. You wouldn't believe me if I told you, Audra said finally. Try me on the way back, Sho suggested, landing his helicopter with the gentlest bump on the resort helipad. Welcome back to the resort. Audra thanked him and climbed out, trotting across the tarmac to the gate. She caught a glimpse of a well-dressed woman waiting by the fence, before the woman crossed to the helicopter, taking a seat behind Sho. A guest, Audra guessed, on her way to do touristy things in town, as she wasn't burdened by any luggage. Audra shouldered her own small bag of clothes and essentials, waved at Sho and headed for the Pearl Villas. Jay had moved from the luxurious Villa Maxima to the slightly less opulent and definitely smaller Villa Penguin, which, if she'd guessed right, he now shared with Penny the psycho. She breathed in the scent of frangipani and salt that was uniquely Broome, but untainted by the earthy Pindon dust that pervaded the mainland. The resort had a freshness all its own. You came. Jay rose from the veranda, beaming. He enveloped her in a hug, holding her for a few seconds longer than necessary until he added, How could I have forgotten about those perfect tits of yours? Audra shoved him away. Given how many you've seen since the last time you saw mine, I'm surprised you remember them at all. If you're just going to ogle me, then I'll turn around and leave. I'll block your video messages too. He swallowed with what looked like considerable effort. All right, I'll try. It's just, I hugged you and they were right there and fuck, it's good to see you. Not getting enough action from Penny, in other words? Audra asked, unable to keep the sharp edge from her tone. Jay darted a glance at the villa, then at the path to the main hotel. Walk with me. Audra followed him down a familiar path to the private beach he'd taken her to, when she'd been forced to act as his nurse and minder for a few days. Only a year had passed since then, but it felt like much longer. So much had happened in the intervening time. This time, she didn't hesitate when she came to the crevasse between two rocks, where the ocean fed the lagoon at high tide. She jumped wider cracks in the ice in Antarctica. This was nothing. She sailed across and continued along without breaking stride, doing her best to ignore Jay's admiring stare as she overtook him. Gratifying as it was to hold a rock star's full attention, she knew how fleeting it could be. If another woman walked past, his eyes would follow her. But the hidden beach was empty, so Audra turned to face him. So, did you invite me up here as a favor to Penny, so she could finish me off? Confusion creased Jay's face. What? Penelope isn't on the island. She's gone home to her family. But you were stupid enough to propose to her, weren't you? Audra persisted. The Jay she'd originally met would have bristled at the insult. The man in front of her hung his head. Yes. If you value your life, you won't go through with it, she said. Jay snorted. Are you seriously threatening me? Audra laughed. I don't have to. She's the threat, not me. Remember when I took a blow to the head here, and you acted like you'd gotten one too, writing Shakespeare on the bloody ceiling? She's the one who hit me, and she would have killed me if one of the personal trainers hadn't pulled her off me. She was mad because she got fired for bonking you in the lagoon, but she didn't attack you. The crazy bitch went for me, because she thought I dobbed her in. Like I needed to. Everyone saw you that day. That's who she was? Jay exclaimed. Fuck, I knew I remembered her from somewhere. I just couldn't work out where. Silly rockstar. Audra shook her head. After I talked to you last week, I watched the first couple of episodes. It's so obvious she was gunning for you from the beginning. You know she slept with half the guys on the island while she was here? She was worse than you. And she used to do it during work time too, so the rest of the housekeeping staff had to pick up the slack because she didn't do her job at all. Jay wet his lips. So, if we'd maybe had a disagreement and she decided not to speak to me, I should probably keep it that way? Too late. He'd already pissed Penny off. Oh, Jay. You didn't. She left me a note. He kicked the sand, sending a spray of it into the lagoon. They all leave me. I've read every fucking romance book in the library. The guys in those all get happily ever afters. All of them. Even the assholes who should be locked up because of the way they abuse their women. It doesn't matter how fucked up those heroes are. They always get to be happy. Me, I get the girl, and just when I think I'm happy, she buggers off with barely a word. What am I doing wrong? Anguished rockstar now. No, give him his due, he was an anguished, frustrated, clueless man who deserved her pity. Money couldn't buy love or sense. Have you ever wondered if maybe you're not a typical romance hero? Audra ventured. I mean, how many of them actually have to try or read romance to learn what they should be doing? Not many. It could also be the women you're choosing. Maybe they're just not right for you, which is why it never works out. Most people have to date a lot of people before they find someone worth sticking with. Hundreds? Jay ventured. Try thousands, Audra thought but didn't say. Not usually, no. But I'm not sure a post-concert orgy where you don't even remember the girls' names counts as a date. I can't date like normal people do. I can't even meet people normally anymore without being recognized. No one sees me as a person. Just a rock star. Bloody hypocrite. The last time she was on the island, he'd moaned about how much he hated the band breaking up, so he wouldn't be a rock star anymore. I thought you liked being a rock star, Audra said carefully. When I'm on stage and shit, yeah. When I'm signing autographs and everyone looks at me like they think I'm awesome, shit yeah. But when I want someone to share my life with, I want someone who can see through all the bullshit to me. He eyed Audra. Like you do. Yes, but that's because I've seen you when you're not being an asshat, Audra thought, fighting to find a more diplomatic way of putting it. That's because I've seen you drop the rock star facade when you're vulnerable, and I helped you. It's hard to see you as an idol when I've seen you scared. I guess if I believed in such things, I'd say I've seen your soul. Raw and unpolished and real. But you still helped me. Jay grabbed her hands. You helped me. You stayed. And even when you said you didn't want to talk to me while you were in Antarctica, you still took my calls and listened. You even gave good advice, which I sometimes followed. Sometimes. Audra smothered a laugh. Sometimes was better than never, which was what she'd expected of him. It was my job here, Jay. I was the maid assigned to the villas. It was my job to help you. His grip tightened as she tried to pull away. Maybe at first, but not after you left the island. I'd never have gotten over Fung's betrayal if it weren't for you. Well, you and Zan. He cleared his throat. And you're here now. Do you want to stay? I'm sure I can pull some strings to get you posted to a weather station up here instead of a place where there's nothing but penguins. No, Jay. I want to go to Antarctica again. It's amazing there. And there's an opportunity to do further study there too. Maybe even a PhD. She laughed. Listen to me. I never thought I'd be able to afford to do it, but the thought of being the one to discover something, to add to the store of human knowledge because of something I've done, however small, it means I'm not just someone's maid, destined to clean up other people's messes for the rest of my life. I have the opportunity to make a difference for once in my life, and I'm going to take it if I can. What do you have to do to get it? Apply to some university or other and convince the professors to take you? Those guys don't get paid much. Maybe I could. No. She glared at him. You are not going to pay off any professor, anywhere, to buy me entrance into a PhD program. Besides, it wouldn't work. It's a program they're offering through the Bureau. We have 6 months to build an online following, promoting how great it is to work for the Bureau. I'm going to do a video channel with regular vlogs about my life in Antarctica. Jay nodded. And wait for the right video to go viral. That's what happened for Chaya. Just boom. One interview went viral and suddenly Necessary Evil was the most downloaded song on iTunes that day. It was mental. Are you offering to write me a song? It was Jay's turn to laugh. Fuck no. You wouldn't want me to. I never wrote any of our songs. I just performed them. But if I posted something saying how I thought it'd be cool if all my fans followed you, you'd win for sure. Don't you dare. Audra ripped her hands out of his grip. If I get this, it'll be through my own effort, not because I know someone famous. I earn things through merit, not through favors. But that's not how the world works, Jay argued. It's who you know, not what you know. Chaya was one of 1,000 bands until we scored that TV interview because of who we knew. Sure, we're good, but there were plenty of other bands better than us. It was luck and circumstance and other people who made the band what they became. You don't get a couple million followers from just putting up a few videos and being good. You need more than that. Something that'll make the world want to watch every minute. He wasn't wrong, but Audra knew all this. I'll have penguins. Penguins won't make you go viral, Jay said. You need to do more than that. What then? Audra challenged. The man might have millions of followers, but he wouldn't have the first idea on how to get them in the first place. Marry me. What? Jay swallowed. Marry me. It's one thing you could do that would definitely get you the worldwide attention you want. The minute the media learn your name, they'll all go wild for you. Like they did for Flavia, you mean? No. They buzzed around her because of the auction, not because of me. I still don't think the media know about my involvement. That's completely different, he insisted. Marry me, Audra. The man was insane. You mean marry you and stay here? Instead of going to the South Pole? That's what I'd like, yes, but if you really feel you need to go, I guess you could. Stop. Just stop. The answer is no, Jay. No matter what you might think, or what I might have thought the last time I was here, I am not made to live my life as arm candy to a rock star, or as a maid in someone's hotel. I'm capable for more than that. I'm made for adventure, for discovery, for the icy wasteland that's the South Pole, he asked bitterly. Yes. Audra exploded. I'm made for the South Pole. Not for you. He got that kicked puppy look. Why not? Audra bit her lip. When he looked at her like that, it was hard to remember all her objections to him as a person. He was unbelievably good in bed, but he was as troubled as her brothers for all that, and she didn't want to spend the rest of her life propping up his ego while her own life went on hold. She'd done that for her family for as long as she could remember. Now it was time for her to live her own life. And win that contest on merit, without cheating by asking for favors from Jay. Cheating. The perfect excuse. Because you cheated on me. Not just once but with hundreds of girls, she said. It wasn't cheating. Jay protested. We weren't together. So if I go to Antarctica and you stay here and either of us sleep with anyone else, you don't think it's cheating because of geography? No, he ventured. Guess again. But we weren't together. It's not like we were married or anything, he insisted. I didn't cheat on you, Audra said softly. All the time I was in Antarctica, I didn't sleep with anyone. While you probably slept with half the country. Who would you sleep with in Antarctica? Jay scoffed. There's no one there. Just penguins and seals and whales and shit. In summer, there are plenty of people there. Researchers. People who keep the bases operational. More people than you have on this island in peak season. If I went to Antarctica looking for love, I bet I'd find it. You wouldn't find better than me. The asshat had returned. Audra stared at him steadily, measuring her words carefully. Jay, even the penguins there are better than you because they mate for life. They're faithful. Unlike you. Not as big as me. Penguins have tiny dicks. She didn't want to know when he'd seen a penguin's genitals. An elephant seal then, Audra retorted, trying hard not to laugh. Just the thought of getting close to an elephant seal, let alone, ugh. But you know what? It doesn't matter. Here's something you missed in all your romance reading: cheaters never win. A man who cheats on his beloved never gets a happily ever after. It's one of the cardinal rules of romance. Never, he whispered. She met his pleading gaze. Never. Oh shit, if she stayed another moment, she'd give in to him. Again. And she couldn't. Goodbye, Jay, she said, striding off before he could follow her. The moment she was out of sight, she broke into a run, hoping to reach the main building, where she could hide until the helicopter returned for her. No way was she spending any more time on the island with Jay Felix. She didn't want to do something else stupid. It was time for adventure again, at the bottom of the world. And she didn't need a man to help her succeed. This time, she'd do it all on her own. 11. It seemed like no time at all before Jean was back at SeaTac Airport, waiting in the departure lounge for the boarding call for his flight to New Zealand. The first of several flights really, but that didn't matter. The first time he'd done this, his heart had been filled with eager excitement at the adventure awaiting him at the bottom of the world. Now all he felt was grim determination. Sure, there'd be adventure and excitement and all, but underlying that was his true goal. A simple one really, to discover, so his name would be remembered. Some distant relation centuries ago had first described king penguins for science. Now it was his turn to make his mark, unfettered by family or a whining wife, who wanted to hold him back from greatness. He was adding to the vast body of human knowledge through science, a noble cause certainly. Anyone could breed and work a boring day job. Only a handful of people got to make a difference, to discover things. He wouldn't screw it up this time. Dragging himself home to a wife who didn't want him. Instead, he should have been taking the next flight back to Antarctica, to finish his research. Most people wouldn't have gotten a second chance when they'd messed up so badly, and no one got a third. This time, he wouldn't let any woman stand in his way. His goal was as clear in his mind as it was when he started studying, without being clouded by thoughts of daring. She'd seduced him, he knew now, tempting him away from his true calling so that he could satisfy her dreams while his shriveled and died. Sure, the sex had been okay in that there'd been plenty of it, but he'd always thought a marriage ought to have a bit more to it than bonking like rabbits and the inevitable result, kids. Shared feelings maybe. Love. Or similar goals. It was obvious to him now that the feelings and love had all been on his side, while daring had felt nothing for him. As for goals, well, he had his own now. But he wasn't sharing them with anyone, no matter how good she looked naked. No, shared goals meant shared glory, and he was having none of it. Let Darian see what she'd lost when she'd discarded him to get with that nerdy computer guy. When Jean finally decided he'd had enough adventure for a bit and settled down for a little while to have kids, they'd know their dad was a great man who'd helped discover things. A scientist. A scholar. Someone to be proud of, with a reputation to live up to. But all that was years away. He was young. He had all the time in the world to find a wife and have kids and all that. Right now he had a PhD to complete, and a postdoc to plan. And any woman who tried to seduce him away from his work would be in for a rude shock. No one would distract him from his goals this time. Not even if she owned a perfect pair of tits. 12. Audra planted her feet on the deck and took a deep breath. She hadn't counted on feeling nervous before her first vlog. Best to get started then. She pressed the record button. Hi, I'm Audra, a graduate meteorologist on my way to my first posting, and this is my ride. She lifted the camera and panned across the deck, turning slowly on the spot until she'd shown them the full circle of her view. The Aurora Australis, a 95-meter-long icebreaker that can cruise through sea ice more than a meter thick. It might be spring in Australia, but there's ice in Antarctica year-round, so I've got my gloves, my hat, and my polar-thickness coat to keep warm. Most of the other 100 or so passengers are inside, grabbing something to eat in the mess hall, working out in the gym, chilling in the rec room, or catching up on sleep in their bunks. The sea out here can get pretty rough, with the sort of 10-meter swell I'd expect to see in cyclones further north, but today it's relatively calm, so I'm out here in the hope of seeing whales. Humpback and southern right whales are headed south with me, to spend their summer in Antarctica. She leaned on the railing, holding the camera steady as the ship cut through the waves. There wasn't a whale in sight, but she figured she might use the ocean footage for something else later when she cut the video. If she did catch a whale, it would be an added bonus. A gust of wind tugged at her hat, so she shoved it further down on her head, stroking the faux fur like the cat it reminded her of. She'd splashed out in the stocktake sales while she was in Melbourne, buying a new hat and coat and gloves to supplement the standard expedition gear. Now she was glad of it, she'd stand out in the videos. Audra waited until her fingers started to go numb, then turned the camera off and headed inside. She took several videos over the next week, trying her best to make shipboard life look fun. She uploaded them over the ship's slow internet connection and watched the number of views slowly creep up. Maybe these viral video things were harder to create than she'd thought. 3 days out of Davis, they ran into a storm. Audra wasn't sure how big the swell was, but it tilted the ship to some crazy angles as it made most people seasick. Suddenly, inside the ship was the last place she wanted to be, with the stench of biller combined with bleach and disinfectant everywhere she went. Everyone else took to their bunks except the crew and a few unaffected passengers, Audra included. While she was sitting in the near-empty mess hall, tinkering with the zoom on her ocean video to see if she'd captured any whales or not, she encountered Doug, who remembered her from her last voyage. They got to talking about her videos and her project, so he invited her up to the bridge to film the storm from the best vantage point. Audra eagerly accepted, hurrying back to her shared cabin to retrieve her camera and stow her laptop. She left her fellow groaning passengers in their curtained-off bunks, and made her way carefully up the ladders to the control center of the ship. With every step, she had to remind herself to keep 3 points of contact. It didn't stop her from being bumped against the wall whenever the ship lurched, but it kept her from losing her footing. Audra exchanged nods with the captain as his eyes darted from one display to another, before he peered out of the spray-spattered glass to the tempest outside. "Wow," she breathed, her own eyes fixed over the seething sea as the waves laid siege to the deck. She'd seen the waves licking at the mess hall windows like they'd wanted to taste her lunch, but here they were enormous, from one rain-fogged horizon to the other. She lifted her camera. "Can I?" She gripped the nearest railing and held her camera to the glass, her own eyes glued to the storm outside. A normal person would have been frightened. She should have been frightened. As a meteorologist, she knew what sort of power she was seeing, but she didn't care. Or maybe more accurately, she did care, but she found it more awe-inspiring than frightening. No one could control this sort of power, raw, untamed, glorious. She didn't have enough words to describe it. Nevertheless, she tried, murmuring a description of the storm into the camera's microphone that couldn't do the phenomenon justice. She hadn't thought anyone heard her until the captain remarked, "This is nothing. You should see the storms we get in Drake's Passage." "Really?" Audra asked. In her head, she added an item to her bucket list: travel through a storm in Drake's Passage. "Yeah. Worst patch of water in the world, but the only way to travel between South America and Antarctica. I wouldn't want to take this old bucket through there anymore," he said. Audra laughed. If the Aurora Australis was a bucket, it was the biggest, reddest bucket in the world. "She doesn't look that bad to me." "That's because you're not an expert on ships." She bristled for a moment, before conceding that he had a point. Most icebreakers are only good for 20 years or so before they need a massive rebuild. They take a lot of punishment between the storms and the ice they constantly have to shove their way through. This bucket has so many dents in her, it's no wonder someone's ordered her replacement. None too soon either, she's 26 and overdue for retirement. For the first time, Audra didn't feel so secure. Is she safe? Safe enough, or she wouldn't be sailing this season. Audra nodded, satisfied. Before she'd left Hobart, the Australian Antarctic Division staff had insisted she do an updated safety training course before she left, on her supervisor's instructions. Now, she wasn't just an emergency surgical assistant, but a safety officer tasked with preventing injuries too. "Don't be scared," the captain said. "We're not the Titanic. Plenty of lifeboats and supplies aboard for everyone if the worst were to happen and this ship sinks." "Oh, I'm not scared," she replied, lifting her gaze to the window again. Was it strange for a meteorologist to sympathize with the storm? Maybe. 13. Jean deliberately turned his back on the storm outside. He preferred to be in the relative safety of McMurdo Station, instead of the whiteout that had engulfed the rest of Ross Island. He wasn't the only one trapped in the station because of the bad weather. A bunch of scientists and technicians were due to replace the winter staff at the South Pole Astrophysics Station, which they all referred to as the Ice Cube. Jean wasn't sure if that was its actual name or some sort of nickname for whatever its official title was. Either way, they weren't happy to be stuck here instead of heading inland to start their research. He joined them in drinking away their communal sorrows to the point where he was down to his last 2 bottles of whiskey. If he didn't stop soon, he'd have nothing to celebrate with when he finally found that penguin colony. Sighing, he reluctantly switched to water. He'd stick to beer until the storm blew over. He couldn't really complain. He'd managed to get a lift out to New Zealand's sub-Antarctic islands with a cruise ship, so he'd already started his research for the season. Numbers were up at all the king penguin colonies as he'd predicted, but the forced idleness meant he'd already had time to include his findings in his thesis and fire off a copy to Louis. So Jean was left to cool his heels, waiting for a ship to take him to Australian Davis Station, before meeting up with the oceanography survey ship that would take him out to Heard Island. He didn't need to see the South Pole to be satisfied. Just one more island to conquer and he'd be a happy man. 14. Welcome back to Davis. Shelley enveloped Audra in a hug the moment she stepped off the icy helipad. Audra returned the hug, still dazed at having to be flown to the station over a substantial slab of sea ice, too thick for even the icebreaker ship to negotiate. "Thanks, boss," she said awkwardly. "I don't remember that much ice when I left at the beginning of the year." Shelley waved her hand. "That's because it all melted over the summer, of course. This is winter reminding us it's not done with us yet. And I'm not really your boss. Just on paper because they had to put someone in charge. We both answer to Lord High whatever his name is in Kingston." Audra laughed. "You don't know your own boss's name?" Shelley shrugged. "There's a new one. I haven't met him yet." Hopefully I won't until the summer's over and I head back to the mainland. In the meantime, I hope you brought all the equipment with you, because we got the go-ahead for another expedition to the South Pole to upgrade that weather station. We're both going this time. Audra wanted to cheer. How many people got to visit the South Pole in their lifetime, let alone twice? This was why she'd taken the Antarctic posting. It gets better, Shelley continued. There's a team of oceanographers doing a seabed survey off Heard Island. We got approval to set up a permanent weather station on the island last summer, but the crates are still in storage, because shipping schedules wouldn't allow for an expedition last season, what with that medevac and all. Audra nodded. How could she forget? Let's hope we don't have another one of them this year. Shelley's eyes X-rayed her. That's right, you had to help out with that one. Was it bad? Conscious of the other people around, Audra nodded again quickly, saying, I'll tell you about it sometime. Any chance we can go inside? I'd like to dump my stuff somewhere. Sure. Shelley led the way into the summer accommodation block. After they'd passed a number of rooms, she pointed at a door with Audra's name sticky labeled to it. This is you. Audra squinted at the second label. This one says Jean Pennant. Never heard of her. I don't think she was on the ship with me. So I'm not rooming with you anymore? Shelley shook her head. All the winter staff got assigned their own rooms, but this building's for summer researchers while they're not in the field. Jean's part of the Heard Island expedition, which is why I asked to have her bunk with you. Between Shelley's manic grin and the way she rubbed her hands together, Audra knew she had a secret she was dying to tell. Go on, spill it, Audra said. Well, that remote weather station's only gathering dust, so I pushed for a spot on that expedition for a meteorologist. They said they didn't need a meteorologist, but they will need a safety officer for island operations. Shelley's eyes danced. So you volunteered me? Audra guessed. Actually, that's how I managed to persuade the guys in head office in Kingston that we needed an extra meteorologist. Specifically for that project. Already, Audra wondered what she could film while she was in the field. What's out there? She asked. Lots of animals. Your roommate's a biologist. Everyone loved penguins. Seals could be cute too. Audra exhaled slowly. So it'll be a busy summer. A South Pole expedition and one to Heard Island too? I hope I brought enough spare batteries. For what? Audra explained about her video channel, which Shelley demanded to see. Audra unpacked her laptop and pulled up the latest video she'd posted, the view from the bridge during the storm. Unlike the first few videos, this one had over 200 views. Maybe not viral, but still a definite improvement, she decided. Before Shelley had finished watching it, the computer pinged with an incoming video call. Audra debated whether she wanted to answer it, but in the end, she gave in and let Jay's call connect. Are you all right? He demanded. Yes. I just arrived at Davis Station. Why wouldn't I be? Audra replied. Your video. The ship in the storm. Audra burst out laughing. You're watching my video channel? Of course I am. It's been 3 days since you posted it, and you haven't been online at all. If I didn't reach you today, I was going to send a search party out to find you. Shelley laughed softly. That's the bloke who isn't your boyfriend, right? Audra pressed her lips together. That's right. And who never will be. Now you know I'm alive and not floating somewhere in the Southern Ocean. What do you want, Jay? Shelley left, closing the door behind her. I need your advice for a date. Audra fought down her laughter. A date? Jay, I think you've tried every romance trope in the book. Who have you set your heart on this time? Before he could answer, she continued, "It's that new hotel manager, isn't it?" "Maybe." Audra chose her words carefully. "Jay, you really have to watch out when it comes to people you work with. I mean, I was just a maid, and I wasn't going to work there forever, but she's the hotel manager, and a lot harder to replace if you offend her enough to make her leave. Not to mention the trouble you'll be in if she accuses you of sexual harassment. And you're not really all that subtle." "I know. That's why I need your help." Audra mentally added dating advisor to her list of roles at Davis Station, then took a deep breath. "All right. Tell me all about it." 15. When Jean landed at Wilkins Aerodrome, he expected to see more than just a few boxy buildings and shipping containers, with a Hagerland parked outside. He helped unload his gear, enough supplies for the Heard Island expedition, and watched the ski plane take off again without seeing any signs of another human being at the base. Sighing, he started to load the gear into the back of the Hagerland, figuring he'd best get it stowed before he went searching for people. If there were any. Wasn't Wilkins the name of the base in that book he'd read at McMurdo, a tattered paperback with half the cover missing about some sort of spy mission at an Antarctic base where most of the characters were trying to kill each other? If some femme fatale walked out of one of the sea containers right now, he wouldn't look twice at her. Not even if she stripped off her clothes and rolled around in the snow. Okay, maybe a glance. She'd have to be pretty crazy to go naked in this weather. "You the American?" Jean turned to face a man who might have been his twin, given they were both shrouded in expedition-issue red coats over black everything else. "I'm the Canadian who just flew in from McMurdo. I guess that makes you Australian?" "Nah, I'm a Kiwi bro, from New Zealand. That's a different country, southeast of Australia, in case you don't know." Jean laughed. "I've been there. Spent 6 months living in Christchurch on the South Island. I still miss the Whittaker's chocolate. Chocolate tastes way different in the States, or even in Canada." Not that he'd had any chocolate during his brief stay in Vancouver. Everything tasted sour there. "So you ready to go, bro, or do you need to use the little girl's room first?" The slightest mention of kids turned Jean's heart to ice in his chest. "I'm fine. Let's go." Jean had driven Hagerlands before, so he was more than capable of driving this one, but today he climbed into the passenger seat and passed the time by staring out the window at the endless ice, broken only by the regularly spaced markers and flags guiding them to their destination. By the time they reached Casey Station, Jean wished he'd taken the other man's offer to use the airport bathroom. As the Hagerland bumped to a halt, Jean opened his mouth to ask for directions. Before Jean could get a word out, the grinning driver pointed and said, "Bathroom's through that door and on the right." Jean climbed out of the cabin and bolted across the snow for the building in question. When he returned to their parking spot, feeling considerably relieved, he found his gear piled on top of an empty pallet, while the vehicle and its driver were already on their way back to the airstrip. With chagrin, he realized he didn't even know the man's name. He resolved to have better manners for the rest of the expedition. There was no point moping over what might have been, he had to move on, burying himself in research and discovery and all the things that were so much bigger than petty people who wanted you home every night for dinner. After spending 2 nights at Casey Station swapping stories with the Aussies who lived there and drinking far too much of their beer, Jean found himself summoned to the helipad with his gear. "The Aurora Australis is waiting offshore on the other side of the ice shelf," the pilot told him. "Normally, they'd head in closer, but there's a nasty storm on the radar and they want to clear Davis before it hits. Get in." More storms. This continent threw more tantrums than a toddler. Jean didn't need telling twice. He appreciated the shelter of a station over being caught out in a storm. He helped the pilot, Eric, load the aircraft, and the helicopter's thumping blades were soon carrying them over the ice to the bright red icebreaker. The first crewman he met introduced himself as Doug. "You're looking much better than you did back in March," Doug remarked as he shook Jean's hand. Jean found himself at a loss. "I'm sorry, I don't remember meeting you." Doug chortled. "I bet you don't. You were completely off your face on drugs the whole time. Doctor's orders, of course. You were a real mess." His gaze raked Jean's legs. "Doc wasn't sure you would walk again after that. Guess you proved her wrong, hey?" Jean nodded. "I wouldn't have passed the medicals to come back here if I couldn't. I need to finish my research." "At Herd Island, yeah?" Jean stared. Did the whole world know about his penguin discovery? It took a moment for realization to dawn. "You collected me from the research vessel so they could finish their survey. So that's how I got on a cargo plane. From passing out in the Apple to waking up on a plane to New Zealand, I can't remember a thing." "Ah, you've got Audra to thank for that. If it weren't for her, we'd have had no one to give you any pain meds until you reached Casey. Then you'd have remembered us real good, and the ship where we tortured you. You'll be seeing her at Davis too." "Who?" "Audra. Pretty girl. Fair hair. Good sea legs and a passion for storms. She'd be great on an icebreaker crew, but she's smarter than that. Some sort of scientist researcher type. Curious about everything, so she really listens." Doug's smile died. "If I had a daughter, I'd want one like her. Don't forget to thank her when you see her. Say hi from me too." Jean nodded, hoping that would satisfy the man. Thank a strange woman for drugging him and doing things to him he'd rather not remember? That would go down well. She probably wouldn't remember him anyway. At Doug's invitation, he joined the crew in the mess hall for a few beers. He'd had time to try a few of the Aussie varieties, seeing as they didn't have any Canadian beer or even Budweiser, and no one had heard of Molson. Jean already knew the one with all the X's on the label wasn't his favorite, but the VB ones weren't bad and the Crown ones were the best he'd had so far. So much for the famous Foster's beer, he hadn't seen a single Aussie drink it. After only a few days aboard, the ship slowed to a halt by the edge of a large patch of sea ice. There was nothing for miles except more ice. "Why are we stopping?" Jean asked. "This is your stop, mate," Doug said. "We've got a pilot ready to take you to Davis, along with your gear. There's another bad storm front coming in, and we're hoping to make it far enough north to miss it. That means this is as close as we get to Davis. Either you hop in the helicopter, or you can come with us for a round trip via Hobart." Jean didn't even need to think before he answered, "Give me 5 minutes." At 4:30, he stood by the helipad with one bag slung over his shoulder and the other on the deck by his feet. The pilot was nowhere to be seen, but 2 crewmen had already loaded the rest of Jean's supplies into the helicopter. By the time Eric appeared, Jean could barely feel his face. He'd have to grow a beard if this kept up. It might be nearly summer down here, but no one had explained that to the weather. Eric grinned as Jean climbed stiffly into the co-pilot seat. "You'll need to get used to Aussie time while you're working with us, especially out here. Time's just a guideline at best." Jean rubbed his aching leg. The bones might have healed, but they'd hurt until the day he died. Especially in the cold. "Yeah, I'm learning that," he said, trying not to grit his teeth. Lateness was one of his pet hates. Darien had never been on time for anything, and it had driven him crazy. He wouldn't miss that about her, that's for sure. Ice, and more ice unfolded below, until the blocky buildings of Davis Station came into view, sitting on the only patch of rock in a sea of white. Eric brought the helicopter down behind the buildings, beside what he said was a lake and the station's water supply. Jean began to help Eric unload his gear, but Eric waved him away. "They heard us arrive, and I radioed ahead to tell them I have their special Christmas supplies. Give it 5 minutes and I'll have more volunteers than I know what to do with. helping me unload. Go report to the station leader for your accommodation assignment, before he knocks off for the day." Armed with Eric's directions to the station leader's office, Jean headed inside, out of the cold. He found the office occupied by a woman, definitely not a he. Cautiously, Jean knocked on the open door. "Hey, I'm looking for the station leader." She gave a tired wave. "That's me for my sins. Who'd have believed we could have a water shortage while we're surrounded by ice? Even with shorter showers, it only stretches so far. I'm Ali, by the way." She extended her hand across the desk. Jean shook it. "Jean Pennant, climate change biologist from the University of Washington. Here to finish my PhD research out at Heard Island." Ali stared. "Jean? Spelled Jean? We all thought you were a woman." Jean made a show of patting down his chest, then his groin. "No, definitely not a woman." He grinned. "If it makes you feel better, I was told the station leader here was a man. I guess it's hard to tell when we're all dressed alike outside." "True." Ali reached for a folder on her desk and cast her eyes down on the contents. "You're here for your accommodation assignment, yes? It looks like you're in luck. You're housed with the Summer Met team in SAM, the Summer Accommodation Module." She pulled a page out of the back of the folder and marked it with 2 crosses. "You're here. Your sleeping quarters are here." She tapped the paper with her pen. "That's living quarters, where we do pretty much everything else except work and sleep." "Sounds pretty simple," Jean said, craning his neck to look at the map. "Here." Ali handed it to him. "I'll let you get settled in today. Tomorrow, one of the training officers will take you through all our station procedures, so you know what's what. They'll schedule you in for the next round of survival training, too, before you go on your expedition. Have fun." That sounded like a dismissal to Jean, so he thanked her and headed out. His boots crunched on the grey gravel road as he trudged up to his temporary home, a big, red barn of a place. As long as it was warm inside, he didn't care what it looked like. The sleeping quarters were easy to identify because they had people's names on the doors. 2 to a room. He hoped his new roommate didn't snore, like the geologists he'd shared with on Heard Island last year. If he did, Jean would requisition some earplugs from stores tomorrow. Just like on the map, his room was right at the end of a corridor. Jean knocked cautiously, but he received no response from inside, so he cracked the door open. Light flooded through the window, revealing an empty room. Empty of people at least, seeing as his roommate had already claimed the top bunk and half of the available storage space. A closed laptop sat on the desk beside a box of tampons. Jean's bag thumped to the floor. He knew a few marine biologists who used tampons in their waterproof camera housings to absorb moisture, but Ali had said he was rooming with a meteorologist, not a marine biologist or a photographer. An amateur photographer, maybe? Jean checked the door. His name was definitely on it, below one that looked vaguely familiar, Audra Zujut. Where had he heard that before? An image of Doug came to mind. That was right. Doug had talked about someone called Audra. It wasn't exactly a common name, so it was probably the same woman Doug said had nursed him aboard the icebreaker last year. Probably best to take the crewman's advice and thank her then, in case she remembered him later and thought he was an ungrateful asshole. Maybe if he saw her, it might jog his memory of the days aboard the ship. Hey, it was worth a shot. In the meantime, he decided to check his email, seeing as Ali had given him the station's Wi-Fi password. Perhaps Louis had sent through some new corrections on the chapters Jean had emailed him from McMurdo. Sure enough, he had, enough to keep Jean busy for the rest of the afternoon and evening. He lost track of time, reading comment after comment and making the required changes. The light coming through the window faded to darkness without Jean taking his eyes off his tablet. It wasn't until the door handle rattled that Jean's thoughts strayed from anything that involved penguins. He leaped to his feet, smoothing down his shirt. The last time she'd seen him, he'd been badly injured and probably incoherent. He wanted to make a better impression this time. As the door swung open, Jean marched forward, sticking his hand out. "Hi, I'm Jean-Pierre, your new roommate. You must be Audra. I believe I owe you for what you did on the Aurora Australis last year." Her already large eyes widened as her face paled. "Shit," she said before she turned on her heel and strode off. 16. Shelley found Audra hiding in the ladies' bathroom. "You weren't at dinner," Shelley said, "so I thought maybe you'd gone to bed early. But when I knocked on your door, you weren't the one who answered." Shelley settled on the bench opposite Audra. "So what's the deal with Mr. Muscles?" Audra smothered a snort. Trust Shelley to have noticed. "He's Mr. Pennant." "Mr. Jean-Pierre Pennant," Audra said, emphasizing the French pronunciation. "The roommate you assigned me." "No." That's what he said. Right before he threatened her with payback for what had happened on the ship. Audra shuddered. If anything, those biceps of his looked bigger than ever, and he wasn't hampered by broken legs anymore, if he'd passed his medical to work on a research team out here. "I can't share a room with him, Shelley." "Why not?" "Afraid you'll see him undressing and be tempted to cheat on your rockstar boyfriend?" "Jay is not my boyfriend." Audra took a deep breath. "I just don't want to share a room with some strange man I don't know, who could break me in half without breaking a sweat." Shelley gave her a funny look. "You've shared an expedition tent with strange men before. It never bothered you then." Audra bit her lip. She was going to sound crazy, she knew it. He was the guy on the ship last year. The one who was injured and had to be medevaced out. "I thought you said that guy had 2 busted legs." "We don't just ship a guy to the mainland for breaking bones. It's usually life-threatening emergencies they evacuate for, nothing less. It can't be the same guy." "It's him all right. He even said he remembered me from the ship." Shelley smiled. "Wait, that's a good thing, right? You nursed him. Sounds like a good start to a romance story to me. And you could do worse. I mean, if you're not interested in the rock star anymore, just think, you could have Mr. Muscles wrapped around you, warming you up at night instead." Audra shuddered. "God no. He's married, Shelley. I remember the ship's crew trying to contact his wife, to tell her he'd been injured." "Just nice eye candy then." Audra took a deep breath. "Now or never. I was left alone with him for a bit. The doctor at Casey wanted me to wait until he woke up before I gave him any more pain medication, so he wouldn't get an overdose. So I sat and I waited. When he woke up, he grabbed me. Tried to pull me into bed with him. He kept insisting we had to have sex." Shelley stared at her. "What did you do?" "I stabbed him with a needle and managed to get out of reach. He tried to get up on his broken legs and he passed out." Audra closed her eyes. "Then I hooked him up to an IV and avoided him for the rest of the trip." "Didn't you tell someone?" Audra shrugged. "He was unconscious. Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself. I figured I'd never see him again, so it wouldn't matter. But now he's here. In my room." Shelley nodded slowly. "Okay. Do you think it might have been something in his medication that made him do that?" "I don't know of any legal drug that makes men with broken legs so horny they feel the need to have sex with the nearest woman, willing or not. And he remembers me from the ship. He said so." Shelley blew out a breath. "I'll speak to Ali and see what we can do. Maybe there's a spare bed in the temporary accommodation he can have." "I'd appreciate it," Audra said over the loud gurgle of her stomach. Sorry, I shouldn't have missed dinner. Go scrounge something in the kitchen, Shelley suggested. Carl's on tonight, and he's still talking about what a good kitchen hand you are, even though that shift you filled was weeks ago. I'm sure he'll be able to rustle up something for you. Audra thanked her and headed off in search of dinner. Dealing with Jean-Pierre Pennant would definitely be easier with a full stomach. 17. You the new guy who flew in today? Demanded a middle-aged man with a bushy beard. Sure did, Jean replied, easing himself down on a chair. His leg was aching something fierce today. Good thing he had the bottom bunk, he'd never managed the climb to the top one. Now all he needed was a drink to take the edge off the pain. Do you guys do welcome drinks here, or is that just the custom at Casey? The bearded man bristled. We're just as hospitable as Casey. What's your poison? Got any Fosters? Jean asked. Everyone laughed. Nah mate, all out of Fosters. Must have drunk it all. A XXXX maybe? Another test. Jean knew the answer to this one too. Only if you're out of crowns and VB. Not bad for a Yank, the bearded man said grudgingly. Bruce. I keep the water running here at Davis. I'm Jean and I'm not American. I'm Canadian. A biologist. I better get you that beer then, Bruce said. By the time he returned, they'd all traded names and professions, and Jean was in the middle of a comfortable conversation with the supply officers about field camp conditions. Pity you weren't here a few weeks back when the supply ship came in. Could have done with a seal charmer then. Jen exclaimed. You see, this huge elephant seal took a liking to one of our sleds. We weren't sure if he wanted to fight it or hump it. We'd loaded it up completely, but it couldn't take the weight of the cargo and the seal, and he was so determined to have his way with the equipment for the new hydroponics lab. She continued with her story about luring the seal away with some fish, only to have him try to follow the trailer when the hag started towing it. Of course, that was the perfect opening for Jean to tell the story about the pair of elephant seals that had humped his hut at the Falkland Islands on his first year out. It hadn't been funny at the time, it had been damn scary, but he soon had the Aussies crying tears of laughter at his retelling now. Jen wiped her eyes and gestured to someone behind Jean. Come over here. You have to meet the new guy. He was just telling us about how he had a threesome with some seals. She doubled over with laughter again. I wasn't aware that bestiality was legal out here, a calm female voice said. Good one, Audra. Bruce howled. Audra. His strange roommate. Jean turned to see her properly before she ran away again. Just like Doug had said, she was young and pretty, with her fair hair twisted into a loose braid that hung down her back. She held a plate on one hand like a waitress about to serve the sandwich to someone. Her eyes fixed on him, as dark and chilly as an Antarctic winter. Have you met Jean, Audra? Jen asked. He's a Canadian penguin biologist. I didn't even know they had penguins in Canada. We don't, Jean corrected gently. Not wild ones anyway. But climate change is a global problem, and penguins are an important indicator species. Sorry, I'm going to get an early night, Audra interrupted. With a wave she was gone. Jean swallowed the rest of his spiel. Probably not the right moment to wax lyrical about his PhD. Jen patted his arm. Sorry about Audra. She must be tired. All the planning for the South Pole expedition on top of her normal job. I don't know how she does it. She hadn't looked tired. She'd looked like she wanted him dead and buried deep under the ice. Jean shivered inwardly, but he hitched his smile back up and rejoined the conversation. He wouldn't let one woman distract him from his purpose here. He'd let Daring do it last time, but never again. They swapped stories until late, when as if by some unspoken agreement, they all decided to call it a night. He padded into the room he shared with Audra, wondering whether she was awake or asleep. Her even breathing persuaded him to let her sleep. Maybe she'd be less murderous in the morning. 18. Audra knocked on the station leader's office door. "Come in," Ali said, glancing up. "Ah, Audra. Is this about the weather report?" Audra nodded. "I've been trying to plot a window between the storms, but I just can't find one big enough before Christmas. Just when we get the all clear for one, I get a new storm warning for Dome Argus. This has to be one of the worst summers on record. So the South Pole expedition gets postponed until after Christmas. I don't want anyone taking unnecessary risks." Ali peered at her computer. When Audra didn't leave, Ali asked, "Is there anything else?" She shouldn't, but Audra had to ask. "My roommate Jean Pennant. Shelley said she'd asked whether you can switch me to another room, so I don't have to share with him." "Well, we don't normally make women share with men, but this time there's an odd number of both, and we're full, what with 3 expeditions stuck here, waiting for the weather to clear. The only beds left are in the medical quarters. So unless you'd rather sleep in a hospital bed, I can't help you. It's just, I worked with him for a little while last season and we didn't get along," Audra said carefully. "Here?" "No, on the ship." Ali coughed irritably. "I didn't hear anything about trouble on the Aurora Australis last year." Audra lowered her gaze. "I managed to avoid him for most of the trip, so nothing particularly bad happened. But things are different here at Davis. I think if we share a room for too long, there will be an incident." Ali eyed Audra as if she were a particularly interesting plant specimen. "An incident? You mean an argument? We get those here all the time. Especially in winter, when everyone's cooped up for months. You'd better get used to it now, because it'll be even harder when you're all living on top of each other in the SMQ." Audra swallowed. She'd spent nearly a year at Romance Island Resort, learning to keep her temper despite lazy colleagues, sleazy guests and the biggest challenge of all, J. Felix. Antarctic expeditioners were so much more civilized than the people she'd worked with at the resort. "I'll do my best," Audra said. "Good. Now can you ask Shelley about her estimates for when that bloody lake will thaw? If it's still iced up by Christmas, we might have to ban showers altogether." Both Ali and Audra winced at the thought. "I'll run the projections myself," Audra said. "If I'm not headed inland for a while yet, and I'm still using up precious water, I want to know." "Thanks." Ali returned to her work, and Audra took that as her cue to leave. As she left the office, Audra sighed. So much for sleeping soundly at night. Every time Jean made a sound, she jerked awake, and couldn't get back to sleep until she was certain he was asleep too. Maybe by some miracle the weather would clear and she'd be on her way inland well before Christmas. A girl could hope. 19. Jean reached Ali's office only to discover she already had someone with her, so he found a chair around the corner and sat down to wait. No one had bothered to close the open door, so he heard the conversation clearly. "My roommate Jean Pennant," he heard a woman say. Audra, and she was talking about him. Requesting a room transfer. That might not be a bad idea. Then he'd actually get some sleep instead of worrying that tonight, she'd decide he wasn't allowed to live a minute longer. He wasn't sure he could bring himself to fight a woman. It just wouldn't be right. Even just the thought of it left a sour taste in his mouth. She mentioned the ship, the icebreaker where Doug said she'd nursed him. Except by the sound of things, something had happened aboard the ship that made her hate him. Whatever it was, he didn't remember. Maybe she'd just been traumatized by seeing his injuries. The idea lasted for a moment before Jean's reasonable side shot it down. She couldn't hate him that much for having 2 broken legs. It had to be something else. He wouldn't have made a pass at her, he knew that for certain. He'd still thought he was happily married then. What on earth had he done to make her hate him so much? He didn't dare ask. He'd learned that early on with Darren. If he asked what he'd done wrong, she'd been ready to hand him a list. All women were the same, and he wasn't going to let another one complicate his life. Audra strode up the passage, ignoring him. That meant it was his turn to talk to Ali. He knocked softly. Ali looked up. If you're looking to swap rooms, I already told Audra no. Jean shrugged. I don't have a problem with her. She doesn't snore, doesn't leave her things lying around, and she doesn't smell bad. So what is the issue? Ali asked. No idea. Look, I didn't come to discuss my roommate. I wanted to ask if you had any update on the investigator, when it'll arrive so I can head out to Heard Island. He flashed a perfunctory smile. It'll get me out of my roommate's hair too. Hair that looked like it would be very soft to stroke, his traitorous brain added. At the moment, nothing's scheduled to arrive before January, so you'll be spending Christmas with us and New Year too. Jean's shoulders slumped. It's just that I have nothing to do. I've finished writing as much of my thesis as I can, and I've even put together a couple of papers for my supervisor this week, but I'm at a loose end. Is there anything you need me to do around the station? He prayed he wasn't volunteering for kitchen shifts or worse, poo patrol, dealing with the sewage tanks. You're a biologist, right? Are you any good with plants, specifically hydroponics? Jean's grin was genuine this time. Are you kidding? I worked as a lab tech in a hydroponics lab through my whole undergrad degree at the University of British Columbia. Would you believe that there's a particular type of chives that grow best when the only sound they hear is Justin Bieber's music? True story. Ali laughed. Good. I've got a couple of our construction guys drafting up a design for the new hydroponics building, but they could do with some help from someone who's actually run a facility like that. I'll send you over to the workshop this afternoon. I can go now, Jean said eagerly. You could, but they'll all be at lunch, so you may as well go eat. Ali's forehead wrinkled. Look, I probably shouldn't say this, but, Doc, can you go out of your way to be nice to Audra? Normally, I'd say she's one of the calmest, most well-balanced members of the team at Davis. Nothing ruffles that girl. She used to work as a hotel maid for some celebrity resort, and that must have taken the patience of a saint. But today... Ali sighed. With looming water shortages, it'd be really great if we could avoid an incident, as she put it. Jean fired off a salute. Yes, ma'am. Us Canucks have a reputation for being nice. I'll get right on it. He headed off. Loud laughter dominated the dining room, spilling out into the corridor. That's the problem with you Mets. One day you're predicting showers that never come, and when you say it's going to be fine, we get another bloody blizzard. You need to train your weather better. A female voice piped up, yeah, it'd be nice if a meteorology degree came with mutant superpowers that let us summon storms or sunshine at will, right, Shell? Audra's face lit up as she laughed. I'll mention it to the Bureau. Maybe even put it in my next video. What are you doing next? I don't know how many times I've watched that one with the elephant seal who fell in love with Jen's sled. I had planned to do a sort of send-off video for the South Pole expedition, but because I don't have stormy superpowers, Audra flashed a cheeky grin, I figured I might hang around outside the men's bathrooms and see who's willing to flash some skin so everyone back home knows how sexy the Davis crew are. I'll do it. A man dressed in chef's white said, lifting his leg into the air and pulling his pants hem up to the knee. Put that hairy thing away, Audra declared. Wait until I have my camera ready. More laughter, and Audra joined in, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Jean stood in the dimly lit corridor, evidently invisible to the occupants of the bright dining room, seeing his roommate in a positive light for the first time. Now he was certain she was the same girl Doug had praised. And she was more than pretty. Something about her just grabbed his gaze and wouldn't let go. Now let's get this pool organized, Bruce said. You both say Christmas, but it could be 3 days either way. So which is it, before Christmas or after? Before, said Shelley. After, insisted Audra. The chef slapped his hand on the table. I'm with Audra. Summer's so slow to start this year, the thaw's bound to be late too. Bruce shook his head. Nah, Shelley's way more experienced. Audra's just a graduate. When she spent the number of years down here that Shelley has, maybe her predictions will be as good. Climate change says everything's melting earlier than it should. So I'll stick with Shelley and say before Christmas. Paul rose from his seat. I'm so sure Audra's right that if the lake thaws before Christmas, I will personally lead a synchronized swimming team through the lake at New Year's. He grinned through the catcalls and cheers. Audra can coach me. You're a swim coach, right? She finally stopped laughing long enough to say, yes, I used to coach. Not synchronized swimming. Mostly people who were just learning to swim, but yeah, I'll do it. If I'm wrong and we have water by Christmas, I'll coach the Davis New Year synchronized swimming team. I'm in. I'm in. Me too. What about Bruce and the other conservatives? If they're wrong, are they going to go swimming too? Carl challenged. Rumbles of agreement came from the others on the swim team. Jean's belly rumbled too, but that was more in response to the delicious scents wafting up from the buffet, reminding him he still needed to eat lunch. Audra held up her hands. They can't go swimming in a frozen lake. I say they should perform a dance routine on New Year's Eve. And Shelley, being the accomplished dancer that she is the best qualified instructor. You're on, Shelley replied. As the others argued over whose team they were on, Jean slipped into the room. He couldn't resist lunch any longer. They were too busy discussing dance moves to notice him as he loaded up a plate. It wasn't until Jean had to decide where to sit that Bruce called, Oi Pennant. Which side are you on? Team Shelley or Team Audra? The others waved him over to a seat at their table, which he reluctantly took. It wasn't until he glanced up that Jean realized they'd sat him directly across from Audra. For once, she didn't look like she wanted to kill him. She looked curious. To Jean's surprise, he found that her eyes were an unusual shade of greenish gold, much like the cushion plants at Heard Island. Azorella eyes. And just like the cushion plants, those eyes lured him in. Team Audra, definitely, Jean heard his voice say in the slow, deep tone he used in presentations, or when he really wanted to win someone over. Darien had called it his devil's voice, demanding that he not use it around her because it steamed up her panties. Audra didn't look the slightest bit steamed up. In fact, she looked as cool and crisp as the lettuce on his plate, which he recognized as one grown in the temporary hydroponics lab. Still green though, like her eyes. Deceptively dangerous eyes, just like the cushion plant that had nearly killed him. He breathed an inward sigh of relief as she rose and left, saying something about how she needed to put her findings into a report to give to Allie before she did the evening forecast. The investigator couldn't arrive soon enough to take him away from the temptation that was his roommate. 20. Audra ran the numbers again, but the results hadn't changed. She could have a proper shower come Christmas, and not before. Shelley was much too optimistic, suggesting the lake would melt earlier than that. Pity. She wouldn't mind seeing the guys do synchronized swimming in the lake. Even if she did have to coach them. She'd have to video that for sure. It might prove more popular than Jen's Seal, which had almost 1,000 views already. 1,000! Though if Bruce had watched it over and over, maybe other people had too. It didn't matter, anyway. She was building a following, and it was more than the blogs the other graduates had. If she could just keep their interest until the contest closed in March, she'd have that training scholarship in the bag. A PhD might not be such an impossible dream after all. Speaking of dreams, why was she so tired? Audra rubbed her eyes, trying to stay awake. It wasn't time for bed yet. The sun still blazed outside, so it couldn't be later than mid-afternoon. It was only an hour or so ago that she'd been laughing with the guys in the dining room over lunch, as they argued about dance routines in or out of the water. In the few days since they'd separated into their respective teams, the amateur forecasters had grown quite competitive. If she did end up coaching a synchronized swimming team, she'd have to video it, if only to prove that she was the first swimming instructor to work in Antarctica. She wouldn't have believed it herself, but Antarctica had a way of showing her just how impossible things weren't if you really put your mind to it. It was just a matter of money, time, and a couple of crazy ideas. Still, she'd done all she needed to for today, so she could relax. Maybe even read a little more of that sexy little romance about a stewardess she'd downloaded onto her e-reader app last week. Mobile phone access was patchy at best down here, but her phone size made it the perfect portable library, especially with the unlimited supply of e-books she could get via the station's Wi-Fi network. The internet was an awesome thing. Audra glanced at her watch. Her mouth dropped open. Midnight? How was that even possible? It was daylight outside, damn it. It took a moment for her tired brain to respond to her outrage. Summer in Antarctica meant a few weeks of midnight sun and a few weeks of total darkness come winter. She couldn't believe she'd forgotten. No wonder she felt tired. In 6 hours, she'd be up and formulating the morning forecast. Audra smothered a yawn as she shuffled out of the Met office and up to the SAM where she slept. At least her roommate would be asleep by now. She could sneak in, snatch a little sleep, and sneak right out again without him even registering her presence. He would sleep well tonight too. Ali had scheduled safety training for the new arrivals yesterday, so he'd have spent the whole day out hiking with a pack loaded full of supplies, building an emergency bivouac to sleep in for the night, before hiking all the way back again today. Audra didn't envy him. Safety training was hell, but it was better than dying of exposure if you were caught out in the unpredictable weather. Of course, tonight the weather was lovely. Clear and calm like a perfect summer's day, if it weren't midnight with snow on the ground. Audra's boots crunched on the road as she headed for bed. She paused by the LQ building, wondering if she should grab something to eat after having missed dinner again, but sleep's call was far more seductive than anything her stomach had to say. Finally, she reached the sanctuary of the SAM. Audra pulled off her boots and stalked the corridors in her socks, not wanting to wake anyone. She pushed open the door to her sleeping quarters, gratified to see that Jean had had the good sense to draw the blockout blinds properly, so it was dark enough to sleep. She knew the room well enough not to need any light to make it to her bunk, either. 4 steps to the ladder, a short climb up the rungs, and she could fall into oblivion for a few hours. 1 step. 2. And it all went to shit. She tripped over something bulky in the middle of the floor, and cracked her head on the ladder so hard she saw stars. 21. Halfway through the hike, Jean was tempted to quit. The combination of bone-numbing cold and his slightly out-of-practice legs made walking nothing short of agony. When he got back to the station, Jean swore to hit the gym. He'd been lax lately and it showed. He'd hurt worse during those months of physiotherapy sessions though, so he just gritted his teeth and got on with it. The crazy Aussies wouldn't let him return to their island unless he showed them he could hike through the snow, dig himself a burrow and survive the night without proper shelter. He could do all that, or he had been able to before the accident. Now he just needed a little help, in the shape of some pain pills. Just as soon as he could sneak some out of his pack without anyone seeing. The last thing he wanted was to be declared unfit for duty and sent home before he found his penguins. If anyone did see him, he could just say he had a headache, but he hoped it wouldn't come to that. Jean found his opportunity when they stopped for a drinks break. Sure, the medication took a while to kick in, but just knowing that the pain would ease as the hike continued instead of getting worse was enough to give him the boost he needed to go on. Digging his snow shelter wasn't so bad, until he tried to stand up again. Then he realized his knee had frozen while he'd been kneeling in the snow. He crawled into his little snow cave, trying to massage feeling back into his leg before anyone noticed. This was the only time he'd ever have to do something like this, so he just had to suck it up and endure it. Heard Island was warmer, with barely any snow on the ground near the camp areas, or at least that's what he remembered. Big Ben, the mountain in the middle, was covered in snow year-round, but as the penguins ignored it, he could too. Later that night, as he tried to fight the claustrophobia of his temporary bivouac, which was nothing more than a snow cave lined with a plastic bag, he wished he had a roommate. Sure, it would be a lot more cramped than the room he normally shared, but he wouldn't be alone like he'd been in that lava tube on Heard Island, and Audra would be warm. Warm and soft and, oh no. He slammed the door on that thought before it could sneak inside properly. Audra was not someone he wanted to share a bed with, or anything else. They shared a room out of necessity, and the fact that she was a pretty, curvy woman was irrelevant. She didn't like him, and that's how things should stay. His traitorous mind filled his dreams with her, both good and bad, so by morning he was even more wrecked than when he'd gone to bed. At least he had plenty of snow to cool his ardor before he had to face his fellow trainees. And a long hike before he had to look Audra in the eye again. Yes, he'd gone too long since he last had sex. Years, actually. Jean knew he could have hooked up with someone in any of the cities he'd visited on his way to McMurdo, or even some of the friendly expeditioners he'd met along the way, but casual hookups weren't his thing, and they never had been. He'd married Darine so young because he'd wanted more. So had she. More than he could give her, as it turned out. There. Mission accomplished. After thinking about his ex-wife, his libido had officially retired for the day. Jean crawled out of his cave and shared breakfast with the other trainees, before they packed up and headed back down to the station. By the time they reached Davis, both of Jean's legs were screaming at him. He knew what that meant. He needed the stronger painkillers, the ones that knocked him out for hours, which he kept in the bottom of his bag so he could avoid them like the plague. Thank goodness he had tomorrow off, he was going to need it. He shared dinner with the other guys, forcing himself to smile and pretend nothing was wrong as he ate food he barely tasted. Once his plate was empty, he was free. Jean grabbed his gear from outside the dining room and hobbled as fast as he could to his sleeping quarters. He dropped the pack the moment he crossed the threshold, kicking the door shut behind him. He pulled off his outer gear and left them where they lay, too tired to bend and pick them up. He staggered to his bed and knelt beside it, so he could extract his pills from the hidden pocket in his bag. Jean washed down the tablets with the last of his bottle of water before he clambered onto his bed, and lay still. After a moment, he decided the sunlight glaring through the windows was more than he could take, so he heaved himself out of bed and yanked down the blind. Blessed darkness, and hopefully a reprieve from pain. Jean sank into his mattress. When the drugs tugged at his pain, trying to take it away, he let them take his consciousness with them. Bliss. Or at least it was, until a screeching harpy smashed his peace into shards. What the fuck are you trying to do? Break my legs? Jean tried to explain that he was the one who'd broken his legs, but they were fine now, not hurting at all, but he wasn't sure the words came out right. So you just thought you'd leave your stuff lying around, not caring if I tripped over it? You expected me to be your personal maid, is that it? Audra's eyes blazed. Green fire. Could you get green fire? She could. She had blood on her forehead too, like she'd hit her head. Jean scanned the room. He'd left his bag and clothes right in front of the door where they'd trip anyone coming in. He should have put them away before knocking himself out. She didn't deserve to be hurt because of him. Mumbling an apology, Jean got out of bed, gritting his teeth as he limped around the room, putting it to rights. His field pack went out into the corridor, and he hung his outer clothing on the hooks where they belonged. He lined his boots up underneath his coat, like he usually did, but he'd forgotten in his haste to stop hurting tonight. Lastly, he shoved his bag back under his bunk so she wouldn't see the pills he'd taken. They were perfectly legal, he had a prescription for them and everything, but if anyone here knew he was taking them, they'd ship him out for sure. Not going to happen. Once again, he apologized to Audra. He mumbled an excuse about being tired after the safety training, which seemed to work. She softened the tiniest bit and nodded. "You're bleeding. You should go to sickbay and get someone to look at that," he ventured, pointing at her forehead. Audra's hand went to her hairline and came away red. "Yeah. Thanks," she said, sounding as out of it as he felt. Jean swallowed. "I'm really sorry. And please don't report me for drug use," he thought but didn't say. She didn't respond. Instead she left. 22. Christmas morning dawned and Audra wasn't sure whether she was more disappointed at not getting to coach the synchronized swimming boys, or not being allowed a proper shower. She didn't want to be right when it meant that the lake was still frozen over. She sighed and hopped out of bed. Jean was still fast asleep, so she dressed and headed for the LQ, where she knew they'd need every pair of hands to help with decorations and gifts. Bruce would be playing Santa this year just as he had last year, but now he sat on the floor amid a pile of gifts that still needed to be wrapped. Audra grabbed 2 coffees from the kitchen and joined him. "Want me to be Mrs. Claus again this year?" she asked. "You're a godsend, Audra. I can't gift wrap to save my life." Bruce took the offered coffee and drank deeply. "Luckily I've had plenty of practice. Just like last year. Bring me the gifts and write out the label while I wrap." She surveyed the pile. "There's a lot more than last year. More researchers this year. I hope we haven't forgotten anyone in the Secret Santa." "Me too. It's a long trip to the shops for an extra box of chocolates." Audra set to work, wrapping gifts that had come by ship from relatives and friends on the mainland, as well as those that expeditioners had bought each other as part of the Secret Santa program. Audra had been told she'd be buying a Secret Santa gift for Bruce, which had been easy. She could see the bottle of flavored Russian vodka she'd bought for him before she left Melbourne, hiding behind an enormous stuffed seal. "Oh wow, someone loves you," Bruce said. Audra looked up. "What do you mean?" "Your family sent you a carton of mango beer." The moment Audra saw the carton, she shook her head. "No, that wasn't my family. It's from a friend who lives in Broome." Jay, she was certain. "A friend who'd like to be a lot more. That stuff's expensive." Price wouldn't matter to Jay, but Audra was still surprised that he'd bothered to buy her anything. It was really sweet, even for him. "More. Gah, your Secret Santa gifts mango liqueur." Bruce set the bottle on top of the case. "And a box of shampoo?" Audra laughed. "That's from my family. With the water shortages, I've been using a dry shampoo but I'm running low, so I emailed my sister and asked her to send a lot more. If I'm lucky, this will do me the whole winter, even if I wash my hair every day." She wrapped her own presents, stuck on the gift tags, and moved on to the next item on Bruce's list. She had to pause for a moment to load more tape into the dispenser before she could finish wrestling the seal into its wrapping for Jen. The stack under the Christmas tree was looking particularly impressive when Bruce suddenly swore. "Jean's not on the list. There's nothing for him." He eyed Audra. You're his roommate. You must know him. What does he like? Avoiding her as much as she avoided him, Audra thought but didn't say. She barely knew the man, and if she'd ever felt the need to get to know him, it had evaporated in the heat of her embarrassment at shouting at him after his safety training. As she'd watched him limp around the room putting his things away and apologizing, she'd been too tired and too angry to realize why he'd left his gear on the floor. It wasn't until she'd been sitting in sickbay for a while that her brain registered what she'd seen: a man recovering from what she knew had been horrific injuries, having just undergone a grueling hike and survival training. She'd needed the day off after her first survival training, and she hadn't been injured. It must have been twice as hard for him. Then she'd spotted the empty pill packet in the bin under the desk, and wondered just how much pain he was hiding from everyone. He'd passed his medical assessment, but at what cost? Now she was torn between her desire to apologize and the need to keep his secret. He evidently hadn't wanted her to know, but now she did, and she wasn't sure she could apologize without blurting out the rest. So she'd gone back to avoiding him. Her gaze landed on the box of beer she'd wrapped for herself. She didn't need them, and she had plenty of gifts, even if she had sent Sam the money for the shampoo. He likes beer, doesn't he? Give him mine. You can't do that. You already bought your secret Santa gift. You shouldn't have to get two. Plus that carton cost way more than you're supposed to spend. Audra shrugged. A 6-pack then. You'll have to hide the rest of the carton somewhere until he leaves with the rest of the summer researchers, so he doesn't see it. We'll save it for the dead of winter. If you're sure. She nodded once. Absolutely. Plus it would be a sort of oblique apology for her behavior the other night, without ever having to say the words to his face. Giving him the whole carton was worth that. Besides, it was Christmas. You're a better person than me, Bruce said fervently. I wouldn't share that with anyone. Audra wasn't sure what to say to that, so she just got back to work on her gift wrapping. 23. Withdrawal symptoms from his pain meds wouldn't kill him, Jean told himself for what felt like the millionth time. He should never have taken them. Instead, he should have just put up with the pain until it went away on its own. He wouldn't be waking up on Christmas morning with the mother of all hangovers that he'd drunk nothing to deserve. Speaking of mothers, he should call his. It was still Christmas Eve there, perfect timing. Jean made himself look presentable, then dragged the desk chair into the best light beside the window, before he turned on his tablet and tried to video call home. His mother must have been sitting at the computer, she answered so quickly. Jean-Pierre. It's so good to see you. See. I told you he'd call, she said, dragging his dad into range of her webcam. Hi Mum Dad, Jean said. Yeah, it's really good to see you too. Last Christmas I was stuck on some rock with no internet access, but this year I'm at one of the Australian research stations, Davis, so it almost feels like civilization again. Or it would if it weren't for all the seals and penguins outside. He peered out the window. Yes, he could still see the elephant seals who'd beached themselves at the haul-out area Davis used as a loading dock when the sea ice had melted, like now. I'm so sorry about Darien and the baby, Mum said. I remember her calling me when she first filed for divorce, telling me she'd had to stick your things in boxes in her garage because it hurt her to look at them. She threatened to throw everything in the garbage, but I made her send them here so she wouldn't have to look at them anymore. I put them. Jean was still stuck on the first thing she'd said. Baby. Did she lose the baby? Jean interrupted. No matter what he felt about Darien, he wouldn't have wished that on her. You mean you don't know? Jean shook his head. We're not exactly on talking terms anymore. That's one of the reasons she divorced me, and married some other guy who could give her kids when I couldn't. But you did, baby. She was so proud you got her pregnant right before you left for your research trip, that she called me every week until she had a miscarriage. She said she told you, but you never replied. Jean felt like he'd been punched in the gut. I never got her message. I should have been there for her. Instead, I was on some guano-encrusted rock counting penguins. Jean knew the divorce had been his fault, but to lose their baby as well? That cut deep. Mum, if I'd known. I thought so. That's what I told her, but Darian wouldn't listen. She got her divorce and married some other man who gave her twins. They're really cute. She posts pictures of them on her social media almost every day. Twins. Jean suppressed a snort. Darian would just love having an instant family in one hit like that. He'd bet her husband was proud. I hope she's happy, Jean said. It came out more bitterly than he'd intended. I think she mostly is, but sometimes the baby blues hit her really bad and then she calls me. Her family aren't happy with her about the divorce, so she gets lonely sometimes. Mum coughed. I really think you should give her a call. No. Not even if the Earth's poles flipped and he found himself at the North Pole instead of the South one. Mum, I really don't think. Come on, it's Christmas. It would really cheer her up, Mum coaxed. I'll think about it, Jean lied. Okay, it wasn't really a lie, because no matter how hard he tried to block the thought of Darian out of his head, she'd still come creeping back to taunt him for not being a good enough husband. A good husband would have been by her side when their baby died. Has it snowed yet? Not yet, but the weather forecast said it should overnight. I can't imagine Christmas in summertime. It just seems so wrong. Are you swimming and drinking plenty to stay cool? Jean laughed. Mum, I'm in Antarctica. On the actual southern continent, not far from the South Pole. The lake behind us is frozen solid, the beach has icebergs and there's still snow on the ground left over from winter. The water's below freezing. Way too cold for swimming. How's your research on those, what are they? Emperor penguins, she asked. King penguins, Dad corrected. I told you he's out there counting king penguins. That's why he has to go to so many islands. Emperor penguins live on the mainland, on the ice. He grinned. Right, son? That's right. They look really similar though, or at least the adults do. The juveniles are the easiest way to tell what you've got. Juvenile emperors are gray, but kings are brown. And both parents look after king penguin babies, but it's just the dads for emperors. Jean talked about his research and life in Antarctica, while his parents told him about their friends and family back in Canada, half a world away. Everyone else seemed to be living such ordinary lives, while he was here, having an adventure. Jean wouldn't trade places for the world. After nearly an hour of chatting, his parents ended the call, but not before his mother had given him Darren's number and made him promise to call her. One day, maybe he would. One day far into the future, when he still didn't feel so raw about the divorce. Or the baby he'd never known about until now. Today it was Christmas, and he was allowed to celebrate. After all, last Christmas had very nearly been his last, and he was lucky to have survived until this one. That deserved a beer and some good cheer. Pulling on his coat, Jean headed out to the LQ for Christmas lunch with the whole of Davis. 24. I think I've eaten too much, Audra groaned, letting her fork clatter to her plate. But it was so good. Best Christmas lunch I've had in a long time, Shelley agreed. Of course last year I had to cook, which was a disaster from the beginning. What happened? Audra asked. Shelley laughed. I got into the kitchen. Some people are amazing cooks, and I take my hat off to them. Some of us, are better kept out of the kitchen. Right, Leslie, she shouted at a woman in chef's whites. Leslie wagged a finger at Shelley. You're not volunteering to be a kitchen hand again, are you? You'll have Carl chasing you out with a frying pan if you so much as set foot inside my kitchen. Leslie nodded to Audra. You're fine though. You don't burn the broccoli, pour a week's worth of mashed potato down the sink, or flood the place. Audra stared at Shelley. You're seriously that bad in the kitchen? You sound like my sister Sam. She burned one of those noodle cups once. Oh, and instant soup. Shelley lifted her nose into the air. I'll have you know I'm a domestic goddess. The sort with minions and acolytes and things who do all the work. Why do you think I'm here while my stay-at-home husband gets the house and kids? Her tone turned wistful. I wish I'd been there this morning though. Video calls just aren't enough. It had been enough for Audra, though she didn't say so. Her family had clustered around Sam's second-hand laptop, Audra's old computer, and exchanged Christmas wishes with her this morning. The boys hadn't stayed long to talk because they'd been tasked with cooking Christmas lunch on the barbecue, and her father had followed them to supervise. Sam and Mum had laughed, explaining that last year they'd burned the sausages, so they'd been warned not to be so careless this year. When Mum had left to prepare the salads, Sam had stayed on just long enough to bemoan how much she missed Audra, because Christmas dinner just wasn't the same without her. Of course it wasn't. Audra had spent the better part of a week preparing everything for Christmas dinner, and at least 2 of them cooking, every year until last year when she'd finally had a break. She wondered who cooked now she didn't live at home anymore, but she wasn't game to ask. Taking care of her family had been a full-time job before she left, and she didn't want to admit how nice it was not to have that responsibility anymore. Because that made her a bad daughter and a bad sister, didn't it? Bells chimed outside the LQ, reminding Audra to whip her camera out. Santa's here, someone cried, pointing out the window. Look! He has his elves and reindeer and everything. The reindeer, expeditioners kitted out in the station's white hazmat suits, with felt antlers clipped to their hoods, and similarly green-suited elves pranced around outside the window for a bit before heading inside. The sound of bells grew louder as Bruce Whoops, Santa's entourage, appeared and took their places around his tinsel-covered throne. Audra's name was one of the first he called, so she dutifully kissed Santa's blushing cheek and took her gifts back to the table to show Shelley. Shelley's turn came soon after, so she handed the camera back to Audra, who set it on the table in front of her so it could record the event without her help. She'd edit it later. For now, the 2 women sat back, sipping their drinks, as the other expeditioners collected and unwrapped their Christmas gifts. Jen shrieked with delight at her seal to the room's amusement, and Bruce carefully tucked his vodka away under his throne as he called the next name, Jean. Jean squeezed through the crowd to reach Bruce. Audra's sharp eyes noticed he favored one leg more than the other, but she didn't think anyone else had spotted his limp. He hid it well. He took his gift from Bruce, then tore open the wrapping in front of everyone and held the beer up like a trophy. The construction guys in the corner, all recruited from the same mining project in Headland that had been permanently mothballed, whooped and cheered. They recognized the beer all right. Jean didn't seem to realize what he'd received. He peered at the label, shrugged, and returned to his seat at the table with the construction team. Shelley leaned toward Audra and said in a low voice, "Funny. I don't remember his name on the Secret Santa list when I paired everyone up. Isn't that your favorite beer?" "A lot of people like it up in Broome," Audra defended herself. "Maybe someone decided to educate the Canadian with some of Australia's best beers. Or maybe someone gave it to him in the hope that he'd share it with you." Audra shook her head. No way was someone at the station trying to matchmake her with her roommate. They'd have to be the only person on the station who doesn't know about how I shouted at him the other night. Davis was like a village. Once one person heard something, everyone knew it. Or they figured he'd need a sizable bribe to get back into your good graces. That made Audra laugh. "It'll take more than beer to get on my good side." Shelley looked uncomfortable. "I know that, but still. He hasn't behaved anywhere near as badly here as he did on the boat. Everyone talks about how friendly and helpful he is. The same sort of things they say about you." She hesitated, then plowed on. "I imagine if he'd caused any trouble for you, you'd have raised the whole Sam just like you did the other night." Audra was still embarrassed at the memory, but that wouldn't stop her if Jean tried to get her to share a bed with him. "If he had, you wouldn't have had to wait to hear the gossip. You'd have heard me ripping him a new one all the way across the compound at SMQ." "True." A loud crack, like a gunshot, sounded outside, followed by several more. Audra's eyes met Shelley's. "The lake," they both said together, sprinting for the door. They paused only long enough to grab coats and boots before they headed outside. Sure enough, the solid surface had fractured in several places, and water sloshed between the gaps. Audra pointed her camera at it for a few minutes, before it became apparent that nothing else was going to happen. She switched it off and tucked the camera into her coat pocket. "We can shower tonight," Audra said. She'd never craved the feeling of hot water cascading over her body quite this much. "I think there'll be quite the queue," Shelley said, nodding toward the crowd who'd joined them outside. "You know what this means, though? It means the new computer model I made works. An error margin of minutes, not days or weeks, like it was before." Audra's heart soared. "If I could test the model on some of the inland lakes, maybe we could turn it into a tool for predicting climate change effects. Maybe even turn it into a big enough project for me to do a PhD." "You're as crazy as I was, looking for excuses to stay," Shelley grumbled. She eyed the crowd. What about the bet they had going? Between the dance troupe and the synchronized swim team? "My guy said before Christmas and yours said after, so for it to happen exactly today." "We could call the whole thing off," Audra said slowly, "or we could say it's a draw and they both have to perform at New Year's Eve. Let the other staff at Davis vote on the winner." She couldn't help grinning. Shelley shrieked with laughter. "Oh, that's brilliant. A draw it is. We'll do it. Just wait until you see their faces when I tell them. Actually, I'd better start researching synchronized swimming. I may have coached, but it was all in swimming strokes for races or rescues. Not exactly pretty. Bite your tongue. Once you get their shirts off, those boys will be all kinds of pretty. I have to make mine dance." Shelley frowned. "And decide on a song." "Good luck," Audra called as she headed for the Sam and her laptop. Game on. 25. "Don't forget your six-pack of sunshine," Paul called after Jean, pointing at the beers Jean had left on the table. Jean snatched up the box and tucked it under his arm. "Fruit beer. What a strange gift." At first he'd thought they were taking the piss, or at least that's what they called it, when they were trying to feed him a crazy idea like it was some sort of scientific law. But the more they waxed lyrical about beer made from mangoes, of all things, the more he figured they must be telling the truth. Especially when they told him to ask his roommate, because she'd worked near the brewery that made it. He wasn't about to ask Audra anything. After shouting at him the other night, she'd gone back to avoiding him. Which meant she was probably still out celebrating, so he could lie down on his bed and nurse his medication-induced hangover for a bit without anyone knowing. Maybe even take some Tylenol to take the edge off. If anyone asked, he'd say he'd overindulged at Christmas dinner. He wouldn't be lying either. The last time he'd had a Christmas dinner that good, his mum had made it. Jean stretched out on his bed, planning to stay there just long enough for his legs to stop aching. He woke what felt like hours later, stiff from lying in one position for so long. Jean blinked the sleep from his eyes, wondering what had woken him. "Merry Christmas to you too, Jay," he heard Audra say. "Did you get my present?" asked an eager male voice with a strong Aussie accent. "Yes, thank you," she said. I'll have to fish out some ice from the lake to celebrate the thaw with it. How's your Christmas been so far? Lovely. Actually, it's my first white Christmas. There's still snow on the ground even though it's summer. Mine sucks, he said. Audra made a sympathetic sound. What happened? Nothing happened. I'm just home with my family because that's what you do at Christmas. And they're taking turns telling me off for signing up for that reality TV show, because that's what they do at Christmas. Jean wanted to ask which reality TV show Audra's friend had been on, but he held his tongue. She might not have noticed him, and he didn't want her to bite his head off for eavesdropping. I've already told you what I think about it. You can't expect me to suddenly change my mind and tell you they're wrong. It wasn't one of your brightest ideas. Audra sounded like she was trying not to laugh. Yeah, and I agree with you now, but that doesn't make it any easier. They're treating me like a teenager again. Irresponsible and incapable of making my own decisions. If you'd agreed to marry me, they wouldn't be doing this. They'd be too busy making wedding plans with you. I wish you were here. Jean's mouth hung open. She'd turned down a marriage proposal? It didn't sound like he was some stranger she hated. She took his calls and he sent her Christmas presents when the postage to here must have been astronomical. Jay, even if I was there, I wouldn't be at your parents' place. I'd be at home, making Christmas dinner for my own family. To be honest, I'm happier here. I don't want to be here either. Can I come visit you? Jay asked. There's not enough water for showers, it's bloody freezing, and the recent storms have confined all the researchers to the station, so we're packed to the rafters with people. Even if you did find a way down here, you'd be lucky to get a couch to sleep on. I could share with you. Audra snorted. No, you couldn't. Besides, I already have a roommate. Audra glanced at Jean's bunk and met his eyes. Whoa. Sprung. Jean made the best of it. He sat up and shifted so he was visible in the angle of Audra's webcam. Hi. He got his first look at Audra's boyfriend, as that's what he had to be. The man looked familiar somehow, but Jean couldn't place him. Jay's eyes widened. You're sleeping with another man? Yes, Jay, and it's none of your business. You know what my advice is? Go home. Go back to the island and forget about your family. Family's great, but they can be a bit much sometimes. You've made your obligatory visit, and you don't have to stay any longer than you want to. Go home. You really think so? Jay had forgotten Jean already, it seemed, in light of his own problem. Some boyfriend. Yes. Now you go and enjoy your Christmas and your New Year too. I'm going to make like a Disney movie and go build a snowman. Audra ended the video call. Now what was Jean supposed to say? He wanted to apologize for eavesdropping, but he'd been here first. She'd woken him up with her call. He decided on a different tack. So is that your boyfriend? Jean asked. Audra scowled. No. We used to work together at the resort. He still lives there. What reality show was he talking about? Rockstar Wants a Wife. It only ran for one season and hopefully won't run again. Nope. That didn't compute. Jean ventured, was he one of the wives or? Audra blew out an angry breath. He was the bachelor. It didn't work out, because she was a homicidal bitch. Are we done with 20 questions, or are you going to ask me my bra size too? With a huge effort, Jean managed to keep his eyes from straying to her breasts. He'd probably pushed his luck too far already, but he'd never been one to quit while he was ahead. Why do you hate me so much? Hurt fled in her eyes. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. Still no words came out. Finally she said, "I don't hate you. I don't hate anybody. Not even Jay, and he, never mind. You probably wouldn't think he did anything wrong, either." It wasn't an answer, but it was an improvement. "Can we start over?" Jean asked cautiously. "Pretend I didn't have that accident last year, that you didn't have to nurse me, and that we're meeting for the first time as colleagues?" She looked too young to be a PhD candidate, but he'd been wrong before. He extended his hand. "Hi, I'm Jean-Pierre Pennant. I'm doing my PhD on king penguins with the University of Washington, and this will be my third summer in Antarctica." Audra took a deep breath. "I'm Audra Zujut. I'm a graduate meteorologist with the Australian Bureau of Meteorology, and this is my second summer here, but I'm about to join an expedition to the South Pole as soon as this bad weather clears. My second trip there." Jean whistled. "I haven't seen the pole yet." Audra shrugged. "I haven't seen Heard Island yet, so we're even." It was on the tip of his tongue to invite her to come with him, but Jean clamped his mouth shut. He wasn't on some holiday where he could bring a pretty girl along after he'd known her for all of 5 minutes. They were both here to work, before heading off in different directions to pursue vastly different research interests. Audra closed the lid of her laptop. "By the way, I'm going to post a flyer on the notice board. First synchronized swimming training session will be tomorrow at 3, by the lake. Just in case you hadn't heard, we're on for New Year's Eve." She left without waiting for a reply. It wasn't until she was out of sight that he realized he hadn't gotten an answer to his question about her friend. Jean still couldn't remember where he'd seen the man before. If the man had been on reality TV, he couldn't be hard to find, so Jean grabbed his tablet and searched for the guy. Pictures of Audra's friend filled the screen. Jay Felix, the lead singer of Chaya. Fuck. Jean had watched the band play live once. They'd driven all the way down to Seattle when he was still at college. Good concert too. So how did a young meteorologist come to be friends with one of the biggest rock stars in the world? Not just friends. The man had asked her to marry him. She'd refused, but she hadn't left him alone like a normal person would. No, she still taunted him with the possibility that she might one day change her mind. She was leading the poor guy on. Dangerous, just like he'd thought. He'd started to warm up to her, but that stopped now. Jean didn't have time to be distracted by some seductress who played with men's hearts like she did with Jay's. She'd soon learn she was wasting her time with Jean. He'd show her he was a heartless bastard, immune to her charms, and then he'd escape to Heard Island. Like the Aussie said, no worries. 26. Audra took a deep breath. Now was not the time to tell them she'd never coached adults before, only children. And she'd never watched synchronized swimming at all until yesterday. Only the knowledge that Shelley hadn't danced competitively since high school and had never coached anyone kept her from backing out. They couldn't stay in the water for more than 5 minutes, so the routine had to be very short. These guys could learn something short in a week if they practiced every day. If they messed up, at least they'd have a good laugh about it. She'd promised to feature the Davis Dolphins, as they'd styled themselves, on her video channel. Audra surveyed the men lined up in front of her. All men. She cleared her throat. Okay, because I've been told we're only allowed in the water for 5 minutes a day, we're going to have to practice this on land before taking it into the water. I've put together a really simple routine that we should all be able to do with only basic swimming skills. If you can float, submerge and kick to the surface again, you should be fine. Is there anyone here who can't swim? 8 heads shook. They were all Aussies, except for Jean. Bloody hell. Now she was even more nervous. Good. Even more good news is that you can stay in your snow gear for the next few training sessions, as we'll be working in that snowfield. Audra pointed. Okay, I want you to make a circle over there, and I'll show you the routine. Then I'll talk you through it so you can try it. Snow crunched beneath their boots as the group walked with her to the practice field. She shouldn't be so nervous, but she was. Spread out so I don't kick you, she said, waving her arms. Audra took a deep breath and lay down in the snow. With all those men's faces peering down at her, she forced herself to describe the routine as she did it. When she got up, dusting snow off her clothes, she tried not to grin at the first snow angel she created. She had to look professional, not like a kid who wanted to build a snowman next. Okay, your turn, gentlemen, she called. Lie down in the snow, make sure you can see me, don't worry about anyone else, and let's go. Who was she kidding? This was exactly like teaching swimming. Using half her body to demonstrate the moves while shouting the same thing over and over, interspersed with encouragement. With her arm in the air and one leg still waving around, Audra felt her body relax. This was easy. One of the men scrambled to his feet. I can't do this. It's ridiculous. Jean stormed off. Bewildered, Audra stared after him. What had happened to starting over? Carl sat up. He's right. This is ridiculous. So ridiculous, it's going to be awesome. We could be the first synchronized swimming team in Antarctic history. The other guys sat up too, smiles slowly warming their faces as they nodded. He's a wanker, Audra, said one of the guys she didn't know. Don't listen to him. Audra blinked back tears. I know. It's hard not to hear it though because he's my roommate. Wish he'd go to the bathroom and do it there instead. A roar of laughter erupted and she felt better still. Yes, she could do this. Jean could go bugger himself. 27. Staring down at the woman lying in the snow, with her white jacket and hat framing her smiling face making her look like some sort of snow angel, Jean almost forgot yesterday's resolution not to think about Audra. The 7 other men standing around shared his thoughts, he was sure of it. Why couldn't she have stayed angry at him, like she was yesterday? Today she looked sweet and cheerful and waiting to be kissed. Your turn, gentlemen, she sang out, springing to her feet. Wincing, Jean lay down in the snow. He hadn't made snow angels like this in years. And the moves really were pretty simple. It was basically the same sequence repeated 3 times, then a couple of extra circles with his arms and it was done. Everyone got it? Audra asked. Someone said no, so they ran through the whole thing again. Jean was proud to say he didn't make a single mistake. Okay, now has everyone got it? It seemed everyone had, so Audra continued, I want you to close your eyes. I want you to imagine diving into the water at your favorite swimming spot. The beach, the pool, whatever you fancy, but don't make it too warm. The water's cool, so it'll be a little shock at first, but you'll quickly get used to it. Jean visualized the college pool in Vancouver where he used to swim laps every morning. He could almost smell the chlorine, amplified by the humidity in the air. No, that water hadn't been cold. They'd heated it all year round so he could swim lap after lap without freezing. A gust of wind blew across the station, bringing the smell of the icy sea to his nostrils. Ice. Salt. Cold water. He wasn't in a pool anymore. Instead, he was immersed in the Southern Ocean. Audra continued, You're going to push through the water and surface. Jean's head broke the surface and another gust of wind froze the water in his hair. He sucked in a desperate breath, then another as he took stock of his surroundings. He was back in Atlas Cove, far from shore. Remember to kick your legs, Audra said. Jean tried to kick, but his legs weren't responding, just as they hadn't at Heard Island. He was back in that nightmare again, and this time he wouldn't survive. There was no Darien to go home to. She didn't want him. He'd drown here and no one would care. No. Jean surged to his feet, breathing hard. I can't do this. It's ridiculous. Before anyone could see the tears in his eyes, Jean hurried back to the station buildings. He knew he was limping, his legs stiffened by lying in the snow, but this time he didn't care. He headed for the men's bathroom in the SAM, which was empty at this time of day. He scrubbed at his face until all traces of tears were gone. He was ashamed of himself. What, was he afraid of water now? And swimming? He dried his face and stared hard at his reflection. He wanted to head back outside and apologize to Audra for disrupting her class like that, but what was he supposed to tell her? He couldn't say he'd developed a fear of water. She and the others would laugh their heads off. He was certain of one thing though. He wouldn't be swimming with them in the lake, in case he freaked out like that again. 28. By the time New Year's Eve rolled around, Audra was exhausted. She was also worried about how her synchronized swimmers would actually manage their routine in the water when they'd only practiced it in the snow, but she dismissed that thought as soon as it surfaced. Their performance wasn't a reflection on her. And it didn't matter how good they were. Not to them. They were intent on making history. It was almost enough to tempt her to join them. No, you can't, was Carl's response when she'd mentioned it. We still need our coach, standing out of the water to remind us what to do, and you need to film it. My kids are waiting to watch this video. Besides, you've already made history all on your own. You're the first ever Antarctic swimming instructor and synchronized swimming team coach. If anyone ever says it's impossible for a swimming teacher to work in Antarctica, we'll be able to point at your video and tell them that's bullshit, because you did it. Mollified, Audra resolved to keep her clothes on. It was hardly a hardship, the air temperature wasn't much above freezing, and the water was colder still. She and Shelley had agreed to let their groups perform as part of the evening's entertainment, before the bar opened and everyone could ring in the new year. Shelley's dancers went first, so everyone crowded into the LQ for what Shelley promised would be a fun performance. Where was Shelley? Audra surveyed the room. Everyone was there, even Jean, who'd been avoiding her all week. But she couldn't see Shelley. Laughter erupted by the entrance to the kitchen, and Audra raised her camera high to see over the crowd. When the dance troupe came into view, she couldn't help laughing either. They were all clad in their thermal underwear and nothing else. The group lined up on the impromptu stage, with the diminutive Shelley standing front and center, dressed in a particularly fetching set of rainbow-striped long johns and a matching top. Shelley struck a pose. Hit it, TJ. Music blared through the speakers, Beyoncé's Single Ladies. Audra laughed so hard she was certain the camera footage would be too shaky to see when she checked it later. But how could a girl not laugh when a dozen well-built men pranced around on stage in their underwear? With her boss no less. She had to admit, they'd be a hard act to beat, but even as the swim team clapped hard for their colleagues, they muttered to each other how it took more guts to perform in icy water instead of just their underwear. Once Shelley's dancers had finished, everyone trooped outside to find a good spot by the lake to watch. The swim team, who'd decided to call themselves the Davis Snowmen because it was too bloody cold for dolphins down here, disappeared inside a sea container that now sat on their snowy practice field, acting as their temporary change room. Audra waited outside, camera in hand, worrying that Jean was right about this being a ridiculous idea. He wasn't in sight among the crowd. Audra squared her shoulders. If he wasn't here, he'd be the one missing out. Her boys were going to put on an awesome show, every bit as good as Shelley's dancers. Sure, they'd picked a Disney song and not a Beyoncé one, but where else but Antarctica could you have snowmen in summer? They'd even spent the morning building a row of snowmen along the lake shore between the sea container and the water. Hey Audra, can you get someone to turn on the music? A muffled voice said from inside the sea container. Audra repeated the request and the PA system started playing the snowman song about summer from the movie Frozen. The container door slammed open and 7 men skipped out, wearing white shower caps with carrots on their heads and tighty-whities below. Audra's jaw dropped. She didn't remember them mentioning this part of the performance. Carl winked at her. "Watch us win this for you, coach." They marched into the lake until they were waist-deep, when they formed up and kicked off the routine they'd practiced in the snow. She had to admit they weren't bad at all. They'd added their own little flourishes to make the audience laugh, so they got a rousing cheer as they hit the 90-second mark and made their way up the shore to their change room. They all paused to pose in the doorway before the door clanged shut behind them at the end of the song. "Fuck, I'm freezing," Audra heard someone say from inside the container. "Oi, watch where you're putting that carrot." She didn't think anyone else heard, as the watching crowd cheered and applauded before heading back inside for a drink. Soon, only Audra and Shelley stood beside the lake, waiting for the swim team to emerge. "They win hands down," Shelley said. "Swimming in that frozen lake in their undies? That takes balls." "Yeah, I think I left mine in the lake," someone shouted from inside the container. "Do you think he meant?" Shelley began. Both Audra and Shelley laughed. The men emerged, now dressed as heavily as the girls, and hot-footed it up to the LQ. "Save me some champagne," Audra called as she and Shelley brought up the rear. Shelley watched them go. "I thought your roommate was supposed to be swimming with them." Audra winced. He backed out in the first training session." Before or after they decided to dance in their undies to a Disney song? "Before, actually. I wasn't in on the undies decision." Their boots crunched on the gravel for a few moments before Shelley said, "Did you hear the investigators due to arrive within the week? It could be as early as tomorrow." "Is that the survey vessel that's going to Heard Island?" Shelley nodded. "What about the South Pole expedition?" "We don't have a date for that one yet. The next 2 weeks really aren't favorable. At this rate, it might be February before we leave." Shelley kicked a stone off the path. "I have to send you to Heard. You know that, right? The director wants you to install the weather station there. Even if it means you miss out on the South Pole." Audra sighed. "I know. And Heard Island has all that wildlife, like you said, which is what the video channel viewers want to see most. My most popular video so far is that one of Jen's seal. Though that might change when I post today's one." "Do you think you can handle it by yourself? I mean, you'll have a whole team out there with you, who you can ask for help if you need it, and once you get the satellite uplink working on the island, I'll only be a short call away. So will Kingston if it comes down to it. But you'll be the only meteorologist, and their safety officer. Lives will depend on your daily forecasts and the decisions you make." Audra managed a smile as she waved in the direction of the lake. "They survived all right. It's not like I haven't been forecasting for expeditions before, and Heard Island isn't as cold as Dome Argus. I should be fine." "Heard has its own dangers," Shelley insisted. "There's a reason we don't keep a permanent base there. The whole island is a volcano too, though I don't know the last time it erupted. It might not be active anymore. Have you asked your roommate about his accident there last time?" "No," Audra admitted. She hadn't asked him much at all, and she didn't intend to, but the expedition's safety was far more important than her personal feelings toward the man. She'd put everyone in danger if she didn't find out how to avoid a similar incident to the one that had given him his limp. "But I will." "Good." Shelley grinned. "Because I don't want to miss out on this South Pole expedition. It'll probably be my last, as I won't be returning after the summer's over. I miss my husband and my daughter, and I don't want to miss any more of her growing up. I might even want more children." Children. The furthest thing from Audra's mind right now, especially in relation to her future. Then I'd better do a really good job at Herd, so they'll give me your job when I get back, Audra replied cheerfully, but the statement wasn't as flippant as she tried to make it sound. She would do an amazing job, she vowed, so she could win both the competition and a more permanent place out here. The swim team was just the start. If she really wanted to make her mark on the world, she'd need to do more than just make a few videos. She needed to do something truly remarkable. Unique. Newsworthy. She only wished she knew what. 29. Jean typed furiously, determined to finish these papers before the investigator dropped him off at Herd Island for what could be his last ever expedition. What had happened last time could happen again, and he might not survive. That meant leaving a research legacy behind to live on after him. He'd already sent the current version of his thesis to Louis, telling him that if he didn't get any new results from Herd Island, he wanted his supervisor to submit it for him. A posthumous PhD was better than none at all. It wasn't that he wanted to die. No way. Jean wanted to live and discover and have a long, prosperous career after his PhD. He was just being practical, that's all. That stupid swimming class had brought back his nightmares with a vengeance, and now he was about to set foot on that cursed island again. The nightmares seemed all too real. He didn't waste time socializing with the crew aboard this ship. They were just his ride to Herd Island, where he'd be working alone for weeks until they returned to pick him up. He had enough supplies to last 6 weeks, though he only expected to be there 4 at most. Someone pounded on the metal hatch to his cabin. "Hey, Pennant. We're approaching Herd now. ETA 1600. Jean checked his computer. He had 2 hours then. Fine. He skimmed through what he'd written. It would have to do. He emailed the draft papers to Louis, telling him he'd be out of communication range for 4 to 6 weeks. In a matter of hours, he'd be preparing to count penguins. Jean grinned. He packed his laptop and the few items that weren't already stowed, and carried his bags up on deck. Some of the crew had already started to bring his gear out of the hold, so he helped them, glad of the extra time he'd put in at the station gym at Davis. His mind might be weak enough to let the nightmares in, but his body was strong enough to fight off almost anything. The mountain came into view first, cloud-topped Big Bend, white with snow and glaciers so that it looked like a mirage among the clouds. He knew better though. Big Ben's old lava tubes had nearly been his undoing. The captain declared the ocean too rough to send him out tonight, so Jean found he had to wait until morning, when the swell had died down a bit, or so he hoped. Jean just nodded and returned to his cabin to get more work done. Day dawned with smaller waves, so Jean wolfed down his breakfast and set to work with the other crew, loading the Zodiacs. He went ashore with the first boat, filled to the gunnels with supplies, and he soon found himself lugging boxes from the rocky beach to a safe spot above the waterline, where his camp would be for the next month. Once the boats were unloaded, they returned to the ship for more, but Jean plodded on, dragging box after box until he'd stacked far more than he remembered bringing from McMurdo. Had Davis sent him extra supplies? The boxes looked like the ones he'd seen at the Aussie stations. He hoped they hadn't sent him a crate of that foul black spread they liked so much. Beer wouldn't be so bad though. The Australian Antarctic Division had promised him a hut, and it looked like the boats were bringing it ashore now. It looked for all the world like a water tank, wallowing in the waves as 2 boats towed it across Spit Bay and into the shallows. It took 6 of them to wrestle it ashore until someone managed to push it over on its side. Then it only took 3 people to roll it up to the campsite. "Where do you want us to set it up?" a crewman panted. Jean pointed at the spot where they'd assembled the mess hall last year. "That'll do nicely." He paused. "Do you need a hand?" "Nah, we got this." Jean nodded. "Mind if I go take a look at the penguin colonies on the beaches on the other side of the Spit? I'll need to do a bit of reconnaissance to work out how long it'll take to survey everything here before I'll need a lift west to Atlas Cove." Knock yourself out, mate. I'll come find you when we're done. The American crew he'd worked with last time wouldn't have let him escape setup. Jean decided to get out of there before the Aussies changed their minds. Grabbing his field pack, he set off past the ruins of the old sealers' camp, to where the penguin colonies were supposed to be. It was easy going for a while as long as he avoided the cushion plants, but then he hit snow. Well, snow on one side and a freezing cold pond of water on the other side, which was no choice at all really. Of course Jean picked snow. His boots plunged into the soft powder nearly to the knee, but he plowed on, determined to reach Doppler Hill or at least a high enough vantage point where he could see the hill. He yanked one foot out of its snowdrift and set it down again, only to hit ice. His foot shot forward, catapulting the rest of him backwards into the snow. Swearing, Jean staggered to his feet, bruised and angry but not ready to give up yet. He pressed on. 4 more missteps later, the last one landing him quite painfully on a pile of rocks hidden under a light dusting of snow, Jean admitted defeat. The ice evidently extended much further than he'd realized. He'd probably found one of the glaciers named but not marked on his map. He glanced in the direction of the camp to make sure he was out of sight, then dropped to his hands and knees to crawl over the snow so he wouldn't slip a 6th time. By the time he reached rock, he was more than ready to stand up again, if only to stop his knees from freezing up completely. He walked carefully back to camp, where he found the guys stacking empty pallets and preparing to leave. "We're pretty much done here," the crewman in charge said. "Unless you need anything else, we're shipping out. See you in 4 weeks, and don't forget your radio check-ins." Jean nodded. He eyed the zodiacs. If he took one of those and kept close to the beach, he wouldn't have to hike across the glacier at all. "Can I keep one of your boats?" he asked. The crewman shrugged. "That one's supposed to be yours anyway. You should have enough fuel for that and the generator, as long as you don't try to head to Australia or the mainland in it." "I'm staying right here where my research is," Jean said firmly. "See you in 4 weeks then." The guys piled into the remaining boat and cruised across Spit Bay to the Investigator. Jean stood on the beach for a moment watching them, but his knees threatened to seize up again, so he decided to warm them up a bit more with a walk along Elephant Spit to Spit Point, where the reports said there was a small colony of king penguins. At least there wouldn't be any snow to trip him up, or ice to pitch him on his ass. 30. "You sure you're going to be all right here with him?" Kevin asked, shielding his eyes as he stared at the sun, trying to angle the solar panels just right. He pretty much hid in his cabin the whole trip, and didn't talk to anyone. Completely up himself, too good to associate with lowly crew like us. He sniffed. "What is he, some big, important American academic?" "Just a PhD candidate, same as most of the other researchers on your ship, except for the professor," Audra replied cheerfully, kneeling in the volcanic dust to check the connections to the satellite dish. Everything seemed sound to her. "I don't know what his problem is, except that he had an accident last year and had to cut his trip short, so this might be his last chance to finish his research." "Still doesn't explain the attitude," Greg grumbled, testing the door on the toilet cubicle. "This is done. Sleep quarters and the bathroom. Have you got the power hooked up yet, Kev?" A yell came from inside the tank hut, before the door flew open and a man stuck his head out. "Warn a man before you plug in the power. I didn't hear the generator start up." Dash glared at the other 2 men. Kevin held his hands up in surrender. "Hey, don't look at me, mate. I'm still setting up the solar panels and the gensets over there by the fuel drums. The only way you could have gotten shocked is if the batteries are charged. They weren't supposed to be. Let me test them." He pulled out a multimeter and proceeded to check the storage batteries. "Looks like you have enough power for 2 days here, as long as you don't turn the hut into a sauna with the heating. The solar panels should charge up enough during the day to get you through the night, but you've got the generator as backup, just in case. Oh, and Carrie figured you might want something other than dehydrated field rations, so she packed you some of today's bake, last night's leftovers, and what looks like a month's worth of chocolate. I hope she didn't give you all the Tim Tams. Radio me if she has, and I'll make sure not to eat them all, so there's some left to tempt you guys back to pick us up, Audra said. Right, so if everything's all set up, I should try the satellite connection to see if it's working. She pulled her laptop out of her pack and propped it open in her lap. Okay, I think it's found the network. Logging on, and I'm in. Anyone want to know which song's #1 in this year's Hottest 100? Kevin and Dash exchanged a glance. We were wondering if you could include us in your video of the camp. Maybe even say we helped you set up and all. Audra laughed in delight. You've been watching my video channel? All three men nodded. It was cool to see Christmas at Davis. It kind of made us want to hurry to get there sooner. And that video with the seal. Everyone loved Jen and the seal. Audra needed to record more footage of the seals here, and hoped they were just as popular as Jen's one. She clambered to her feet. Right, let's find a spot where I can film the camp and maybe get a good shot of the ship and the beach too. The guys lined up, and Audra started recording. Welcome to Herd Island, where we've just arrived. The valiant crew from the RV Investigator have set up our camp here at Spit Bay, for which I'm very grateful because they're very busy men. After dropping us off, they still have to help out another expedition who are mapping the seafloor and ocean currents of the Antarctic convergence, which I believe has never been studied at this kind of depth before. So a special thanks to Kevin, Dash and Greg, for taking the time to make sure I can still broadcast to you from this lonely island, and thanks to all their crewmates still aboard the Investigator. Here's to a good summer for research. Audra panned the camera around the camp. I'll take you on a tour of my luxury accommodation later, and maybe even let you join me for dinner. Wait till you see the gourmet cuisine we get out here. You'll wish you were here. She switched the camera off. I feel like such an idiot talking to myself like that, she admitted. You don't sound it, Kevin reassured her. Everyone at the bases wants to know what the Penguin Weather Girl's up to next, and it gives our families back home a bit of excitement. They'll think we're famous for getting a spot on your show. That made Audra laugh. Let me do one last check to make sure we've got everything, and you guys can head back to the ship if you want. I should be able to handle unpacking. When Jean comes back, I'll put him to work too. To her surprise, Kevin folded her into a hug. You tell us if he causes you any trouble, right? You're the ranking safety officer on the island, which puts you in charge. Don't forget that. He gestured toward the Zodiacs. You did a great job towing today. I'd take you on as crew any day if you get bored doing science stuff at the stations. Will one boat be enough? If you want a second one, we can probably spare it, but I'd need to get you another drum of fuel. One's fine, honestly. I doubt we'll even use it. After all, my job's to set up the weather station and he's counting birds, I think. Audra grinned. Good luck with Bird Boy then. I think he's coming back now. Kevin jerked his chin in the direction of the Stevenson Glacier. What kind of idiot climbs a glacier without snow chains on his boots? I'll make sure he's wearing them tomorrow. I'm the safety officer after all. If you could just tell him you're going, to make sure he doesn't need anything else that I've forgotten, I'll go check to see that the video's uploaded okay. Audra headed for the hut. She just confirmed that the video was already live on her channel and a few people had watched it, when Dash knocked on the door of the hut. It's up, Audra said. Thank you, Dash replied. I checked the stove and the lights and the heating. Everything works. You know where the spare gas bottles are, yes? Yes, Audra said, pointing out the window where she could see Kevin and Greg boarding their boat. It looks like they're going. You don't want them to leave without you. You'll be stuck here with us for a month. I guess not, Dash said with a shy smile, and he left. Audra watched through the window as they motored up to the ship, before the investigator cast off her moorings and maneuvered out of the bay. A little frisson of fear curled around her belly. Davis had been isolated, but this was an island in the middle of nowhere. An island she shared with only one other person, a man she barely knew, and what she did know of him was hardly encouraging. Jean stood on the beach, looking out to sea. As if compelled by some desire to follow the only other people within miles, he set off along Elephant Spit, his eyes fixed on the ship steaming away. Audra sagged. She was hot and sweaty from carrying all the gear into camp, and dirty from setting up the hut and the satellite dish. She'd give a lot of money for a hot shower right now, but showers were once again an impossible luxury. They had enough water for drinking and food preparation, but if they wanted wash water, she had two options: a bucket of seawater or melted snow. Not wanting to bother with either of those icy options, Audra pulled out some of the supplies she'd packed for the South Pole expedition she'd never joined. A pack of wet wipes were more than enough to get her clean, even if they were nowhere near as satisfying as a shower. She switched on the heater, stripped off, and went to work. 31. Jean hadn't made it halfway along the rocky spit before he realized that the brown lumps lined up like sausages weren't rocks at all. Instead, he'd walked into the middle of an elephant seal haul-out area, and the huge creatures were waking up. Not good. Especially as seals could move faster than a tired man with a limp. They wouldn't even have to do anything. If one of them landed on him, it'd crush him under tons of fat and muscle. For the second time that day, Jean admitted defeat. Today just wasn't a good day for penguins. Maybe tomorrow he'd have better luck with the boat. He backed away from the seals as slowly as he dared, before they lost interest in him and flopped back down, dormant once more. He trudged back to camp, resolving to unpack his supplies so he had all the food safely in the hut, along with as many of the water casks as he could fit in there to keep it from freezing. A quick scan of the camp revealed no food or water, nothing but empty pallets that had once held his supplies. Had the ship's crew shifted everything inside for him? He should have thanked them. When he made his regular radio check-in tonight, he would. He'd tell the radio operator to thank shit. He couldn't remember any of their names. He'd been so caught up in his own dread at being back here that he'd forgotten to ask. They must think he was a complete dick. Well, he had been. Sighing, he grabbed the handle and opened the hut door. "What the fuck are you doing here?" he cried. Dodden stopped dead like a deer caught in headlights. The most divine pair of headlights evolution ever gave a woman. Two globes of creamy soft flesh, garnished by a pair of pink nipples that made him think of cotton candy and wonder if they'd taste as sweet. His gaze traveled down more creamy curves to thighs that looked as soft as silk, glistening with moisture. What would it feel like to glide between them, deep inside her as he buried his face between that perfect pair of tits? His blood rushed south to salute her like the beautiful woman before him deserved. Audra covered her breasts with her arm and twisted to turn her back on him. "Stop staring and get out. And if you're going to jerk off, do it where I don't have to see or hear it." His mouth unable to close or even form words, Jean stumbled out of the hut and closed the door with shaking hands. He couldn't get the picture out of his head. If he'd been a religious man, her body looked like the answer to a lifetime of prayers. Even now, he couldn't stop thinking about the things he wanted to do to her. As if that would ever happen. The woman hated him. Probably even more now he'd walked in on her naked. In all her naked glory. Groaning, Jean strode for the bathroom and slammed the door behind him. Yanking down his pants, he let his imagination go wild. Just for a few minutes, he allowed himself to dream about what it would be like to make love to the girl he'd seen in the hut just now. Not quick and joyless like sex with Darren, but slow and sensual and pleasurable, so when she reached her peak, Audra would moan and cry out his name. His hand was a poor substitute, but he made do. Had to, so he wouldn't pitch a pop-up tent in his pants every time he saw her from now on. Because she was stuck on this island with him now, for the next month. And he couldn't afford to give in to distraction, or desire. He let out a shuddering sigh and cleaned himself up, leaning against the bathroom wall to support his shaky legs and weak knees after such a powerful release. She didn't need to know that he'd jerked off, just like she'd told him to. He chided himself for his loss of control, staring at her like that instead of having the decency to avert his eyes. He hadn't expected to come face to face with a goddess who could have starred in his most erotic fantasies, is all. She would feature in those fantasies now he'd seen her, as he'd never get that picture out of his head. $50 said he'd be dreaming of cotton candy tonight. So much for being alone on the island. Jean? Audra said tentatively. I'm finished and I'm decent. It's safe to come back inside now. He emerged from the bathroom, keeping his sheepish eyes on the ground so he wouldn't look at her. Couldn't look at her, now he knew what was under her boots and expedition gear. The pinnacle of evolution. The most perfect pair of. Jean arrested that thought before it went any further. He was here to find penguins, not fantasize about his roommate. What are you doing here? He asked again, more politely this time. Setting up a permanent remote weather station and keeping both of us safe until the ship returns for us in 4 weeks. Which just got a lot harder. When you walked in like that, I nearly pushed you back out the door on your ass. Audra's brow furrowed and she set her hands on her hips. Next time knock all right? Yes ma'am, he said to her boots. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I didn't know anyone else was here and to walk in and see. He waved at her body, not trusting himself to say what he was thinking. All those superlatives wouldn't sound like the compliments he intended them to be. Instead, he'd sound like the sleaziest work colleague who ever crawled out from under a rock. Yes. Audra coughed. Tell you what. Let's forget about it, and do our best to make sure it doesn't happen again. We're going to be working closely together for the next few weeks and… No, they wouldn't be working together. She'd be doing her weather stuff here and he'd be off hunting penguins. They'd be roommates, that's all. Ones who spent as little time together as possible, just like at Davis. Nevertheless, he nodded and agreed to her suggestions, which should stop him from seeing her naked again. Good thing too. If he came face to face with those incredible tits again, he wasn't sure he could resist the urge to drop to his knees and beg to touch. To taste. 2 things he would never ever do, he swore. 32. Audra couldn't get the image out of her head. The way he'd stared at her. Hungrily, desperately. Yes, there'd been plenty of lust in his eyes, but something else too. Longing? Like he really admired what he saw, and he wanted. What a married man shouldn't want from a woman who wasn't his wife. Audra scolded herself. To his credit, he hadn't acted on the urge, and he'd apologized for it. Plus he was staring at her shoes and not her boobs. That put him a cut above Jay, in her opinion. I'll make dinner tonight, but tomorrow's your turn, she said. Carrie packed some of last night's pasta into a supply crate, and it looks like there's enough for 2. Who's Carrie? He asked. The cook aboard the Investigator. Kevin told me she gave us some other treats from her stores too. Who's Kevin? Audra blew out a breath. Did you avoid everyone on the Investigator like you avoided me at Davis? Don't you know the names of anyone you work with? Kevin just spent most of the day helping me put this camp together with Dash and Greg. He stared miserably at the floor. I figured I'd set up camp when I got back. I wanted to get a feel for the island so I could plan out my research schedule. He just asked me where to put the hut. I didn't realize you were all here working while I was. Audra almost felt sorry for him, but she'd seen researchers like him before. Usually it was their first trip south, and they weren't familiar with the rules established to keep them safe. Jean hadn't been particularly safe last trip though, so maybe he'd missed out on a proper briefing. That made it her job. Okay, here goes, Antarctic Expedition 101. First, we establish base camp. No research until we know where we'll eat, drink, sleep, and go to the loo. The bathroom, I mean. We don't skip meals. We don't skimp on sleep. And we definitely don't leave camp alone. She fixed her gaze on him. Do you hear me? He lifted his eyes to her face in outrage. What? You expect me to tag along with you while you do weather things, when I have more important research to do? No. That's bullshit. It's not going to happen. For a moment the mischievous part of her wanted to tell him, yes, that he'd be forced to follow her around, carrying her equipment for 4 weeks. She could do it too, though she'd probably get into trouble for it much later, when his university found out what she'd done. They were paying for her to be out here, after all. Jean was a minor inconvenience. An inconvenience who came with the significant perk of being a penguin expert. If anyone could help her get good wildlife videos that would go viral, it was him. Audra wet her lips. Actually, it'll probably only take me a day or two to set up the weather station, once I work out where to put it. I figure if I tag along with you for the first few days, it'll help me get a feel for the best place to install it. Once it's in, I'm free to help you with your research. She grinned. I've always wanted to learn more about penguins. He shook his head. I'm not sharing my findings with you. Not before I've had a chance to write and submit my thesis, or at least some papers. Audra suppressed a snort. He was one of those researchers. Keep your secrets. I don't care about them. Who would I tell anyway? But you're going to have to learn to cooperate and share information, at least a little. Because the person who pisses off the meteorologist won't get the weather forecasts. And knowing when it'll rain or snow, or the tide's going to be unusually high, or there's a bad storm coming in, will make a big difference to what you get done. Is your secret penguin business worth so much to you? She could see him thinking, sizing her up. Funnily enough, his eyes didn't once stray to her chest. So for 2 days I help you with your weather station, and for the other 26, you're my research assistant? He asked. Put like that, it didn't sound fair. But 26 days of penguin watching. Pretty much, yeah. Barring bad weather, of course. Which I'll warn you about, because we don't want a repeat of your accident from last year. She bit her lip. For my own safety and for yours, I need to know what happened, to stop it from happening again. Whether you love me or hate me or something in between, I really am here to help you accomplish what you didn't last year. So what do you say? We work together until we have to leave this lovely place? Do we have a deal? His eyes were still searching. Maybe he didn't trust her yet. Good thing he didn't have to for this to work. We do, Jean said finally. Good. Shake on it. She held out her hand. A tingle ran through her fingers at his touch, before his hand engulfed hers. He was as gentle as warm water as he shook her hand, and the warmth spread all the way up her arm. Strange? It sure hadn't felt like this when he'd grabbed her on the ship. As if to prove her point, he released her of his own accord, without needing to be stabbed. Audra let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Things were off to a better start than she'd expected.